It all begins on a very busy, snow-covered street where people are enjoying the holiday season under the bright, festive lights. As cheerful music plays in the background, a joyful holiday spirit takes over the entire decorated city. In the middle of the crowd, a little girl walks happily hand in hand with her parents after a fun day out. Suddenly, the family's stroll is cut short when they bump right into an extremely tall man standing directly in front of them. The little girl looks up, completely in awe of the sheer size of this mysterious man. The young man decides to step aside to let the family pass, but he cannot hide his annoyance at always having to hunch over just to let others through. He keeps walking alone through the crowd and realizes that, out of all those people on the street, he is the only one who has no one. Thinking about his own loneliness, the young man heads toward the entrance of the subway station to go back home. As he begins to walk down the stairs, he suddenly stops when he notices something unusual nearby. The prota looks away in surprise upon hearing a sound coming from the corner of the sidewalk. He turns around and spots a man dressed as Santa Claus kneeling on the cold ground. The poor costumed man is curled up, shivering from the cold, right there on the stone floor. Beside him is a small sign asking people to share their wishes with Santa, something the prota would normally ignore without a second thought. However, since today is Christmas Eve, the exact day he lost his parents in a terrible accident and was left completely alone in the world, the prota decides to step closer. He opens his wallet and decides to take out a few 10,000 won bills to help the man in need. The young man then offers the money, along with a triangular rice ball that is still perfectly good to eat. He gently leaves the money and the food on top of the sign to help the needy man. At that exact moment, the fake Santa grabs the prota's hands with unbelievable strength and thanks him emotionally for his extreme kindness. The kneeling man insists on returning the good deed and begs the young man to reveal his deepest wish. The prota is startled by that over-the-top reaction and instantly regrets stepping out of his usual routine. Wanting nothing more than for the stranger to let him go, he tries to pull his arms back, but realizes the man's grip is extremely firm and heavy. The young man goes into shock as he realizes he cannot move even a single inch, while the stranger insists he is there to grant the wish of a generous soul. Santa keeps begging and explains that he cannot return to his magical village until the prota tells him what he truly desires. Seeing no other way out of that bizarre situation, the prota asks if he will be set free if he reveals his wish, and the man agrees immediately. With a serious look, the young man prepares to speak what is on his mind. He says he would like to win the lottery, but Santa complains that this wish is not sincere and asks him to reveal something that truly comes from the bottom of his heart. The prota then goes silent for a moment, reflecting on what he would really ask for if he could. He remembers all the pain of growing up alone and realizes that his biggest dream has always been to have a real family that would never abandon him. So he looks at the man and confesses that he would love to have a wife as sweet as a rabbit and a little daughter as cute as a mongoose. Santa sniffs the prota's hand and says he can feel the purity of that sincere wish from someone who has lived in loneliness for a very long time. He flashes a huge smile and says he feels extremely lucky to have found someone with a soul so similar to his own. With a suddenly frightening look and eyes glowing bright red, the man promises he will find a wife as pure as snow and a beautiful daughter who will love and respect her father. Santa wishes him a life full of joy, while the prota tries to break free from that terrifying grip. Frightened by that madness, the young man manages to break free and runs away, while the stranger shouts that he will use all his power to make that dream come true. The prota keeps running in a hurry without looking back, while the costumed man waves from afar, saying that everyone in Santa's village is rooting for him. Shortly after, the subway speeds along the city tracks. Sitting in the train car, the young man looks at his own reddened wrist, marked by the strength of that bizarre grip. He tries to process what happened and wonders what on earth that crazy man was talking about. Even though he thinks the whole thing is complete madness, he begins to reflect on the real reason he revealed such a personal wish. Looking at an advertisement featuring a happy family in the train car, the prota realizes that deep down, he just wanted a chance to be happy too. He closes his eyes in sadness, wishing only to live a normal, happy life like everyone else. Suddenly, the young man begins to notice a strange smell in the air and realizes that the environment around him has become extremely freezing. The prota wakes up stumbling and holding his head in intense pain, completely confused about what is happening. Upon opening his eyes and looking around, he gets a massive fright from what he sees. He realizes he is being carried in a wooden cart, moving along an old dirt road surrounded by rustic houses. To make matters worse, he notices he is wearing almost no clothes and is locked inside an iron cage on top of the moving cart. The prota looks to the side and sees a bearded man with long hair who also seems to be imprisoned. Another blonde prisoner with an exhausted look stares back at him with a sense of tiredness and resignation. Observing the poor condition of all the other chained prisoners around him, the young man wonders if he somehow traveled through time straight to the Middle Ages. He is completely confused and frozen in shock by this unbelievable twist in his life. Looking at the guards outside the cart, the young man realizes he cannot understand absolutely anything they are saying. He notices that the entire environment looks like the set of an old medieval movie, with people speaking an unknown language and not a single Asian person in sight. Not knowing if this is all just a very vivid dream or his new reality, the prota tries to stay calm despite the creeping despair. At that moment, he finally begins to accept the unbelievable possibility that he has been transported to an entirely different world. The prota begins to shiver violently from the cold and holds his own feet to try to warm up a bit on the freezing wooden planks of the cage. Looking to the side, he spots a motionless prisoner and wonders if the man has just passed away, reminding himself that the living must keep fighting to survive. He approaches carefully and cradles the lifeless body of the other prisoner, silently apologizing before making a difficult choice. To avoid freezing to death, the young man decides to take the rustic clothes from the deceased man to cover himself and endure the harsh cold. Now wearing the patched green tunic, he lies on his side on the wooden floor while remembering the strange Santa's promise to use all his power to grant his wish. The prota stares into the emptiness with bitterness and wonders if this terrible misery was the happiness the old man mentioned so much, questioning if he spent his whole life misunderstanding the real meaning of that word. He internally begs to wake up if this is all just a horrible nightmare, having no idea how many days have already passed since this journey began. Imprisoned and without any comfort inside that cramped cart, they simply kept moving forward through endless forest paths. Despite the difficulties, the young man managed to figure out some important information during the trip, starting with the obvious fact that everyone inside was being treated as an enslaved person. Secondly, he also ended up understanding the real reason they were being taken by the soldiers under such heavy guard. The cruel goal of those men was simply to transport them far away so they could be sold at a market. Suddenly, the metallic sound of a lock echoes through the area as the cage door is unlocked. While the soldiers line up the prisoners, a man who looks like the village chief begins to examine each one of them to choose only those in the best physical condition. Although his pride is deeply wounded by finding himself in this humiliating situation as mere merchandise, the prota begins to feel a glimmer of hope rise in his chest. He realizes that being sold might be his only real chance to escape that awful cart and, relying on his good build, believes he will be chosen quickly. A slight smile appears on his face as he holds on to the first positive expectation since he dropped into this unknown place. However, that illusion is soon crushed and replaced by a deep sadness after they pass through several other villages without anyone showing the slightest interest in buying him. The cart continues its lonely and exhausting journey, crossing mountains and dense forests under the daylight. The vehicle travels along the dirt road while the prisoners remain locked up and closely watched by the armed guards. Completely exhausted and with no strength left to keep fighting, the young man lies on his back in the cage and begins to question if it is really worth living in such a miserable state. It is at this exact time that he recalls a piece of precious advice from his late mother, who always asked him to do his best and live life to the fullest, no matter how difficult the situation. The memory of his mother's welcoming face, asking if he understood her words, echoes strongly in his mind. Looking up at the wooden ceiling, the prota wonders sadly if he will truly be able to endure all this suffering completely alone. His thoughts return to the absurd promise of that crazy Santa who claimed he would change his destiny with magical powers, overcome by a sudden rage. The young man curses the very concept of happiness and wishes that both this new world and his old life would go straight to the underworld. In a moment of pure despair and built-up anger, he clenches his fist tightly upon finding a metal fork lying on the floor of the cart. He points the sharp object at his own neck, believing that the only way to find true peace would be to end his own life to escape this unbearable pain. However, at the very last second, as he feels the cold metal tip pressing against his skin, the prota hesitates, realizing that deep down, he does not want his story to end in such a tragic way. The young man cries as he admits to himself that he does not want to pass away in a miserable place like this, when suddenly he hears a soft voice talking outside the cage. He slowly lowers the fork and looks toward the opening of the cage with a tired expression, not understanding what is going on. To his surprise, a delicate hand appears between the iron bars, offering a piece of fresh, warm bread. Raising his head, the prota comes face to face with a beautiful young woman with long hair who smiles warmly at him as she hands over the food. The young woman speaks a few kind words in her own incomprehensible language, trying to comfort the needy prisoner with that simple gesture. Right behind the young woman's dress, a little blonde girl with bright eyes watches the situation with curiosity and shyness. The fork slips from the prota's hands as he stares at the two angelic figures with wide eyes, completely shocked by such unexpected kindness. Far away, in a quiet corner of the forest, stands a small wooden cabin surrounded by logs chopped for the winter. Inside the rustic home, the young mother and the little blonde girl sit at a simple table to have their meal for the day. The little girl happily sips the hot soup straight from her wooden bowl. With an affectionate look, the mother gently pushes her own portion of food toward her daughter, encouraging her to eat a little more. The little girl stops eating and stares at her mother with her big golden eyes, showing surprise at her generosity. The woman lovingly explains that she knows how hungry her daughter is, and that is why she insists on sharing her food with her. However, the girl points back at her mother and insists that if she is hungry, her dear mother must be feeling the exact same way. With a cute gesture, the little girl pushes one of the bowls back to the middle of the table so they can share the meal equally. The mother smiles from ear to ear at her daughter's mature attitude and agrees that they should eat together. Suddenly, a loud knock on the door startles them both, accompanied by a man's voice urgently announcing the arrival of the village elder. The young woman hugs her frightened daughter, while the voice outside orders them not to open the door, warning that after today's council meeting, it was decided that one of the men brought by the soldiers will be her new husband. The young woman is frozen in terror upon hearing that as soon as the decision is finalized tomorrow, she must be ready to head back to the mountains with her new partner. The man outside orders her to bring food at dawn to welcome the soldiers at the village entrance, leaving the young woman extremely worried as she holds the little girl close. Alone in the darkness of the cabin, she panics, not knowing what to do in the face of such a sudden decision, trembling with fear of being mistreated all over again like in the past. Despite the terror consuming her mind, the young woman knows very well that she has nowhere to run. She looks at the little orphan resting on her lap and understands that, even though they have not known each other for long, she does not have the heart to abandon the child. With tears streaming down her face, the young woman refuses to leave the girl completely alone in the world once again. Noticing her protector's despair, the little girl's golden eyes also begin to fill with tears. Unable to hold back her sadness any longer, the little one breaks down into loud, painful crying. The little girl's desperate weeping echoes throughout the dark cabin, while the young woman tries to comfort her in her arms. Later on, the young woman remains sitting in silence in the darkness, distressed and not knowing what destiny holds for her from now on. Curled up in a corner, she cries softly, begging not to have to relive that terrible nightmare from her past. She then takes a deep breath and turns her gaze away in sadness toward the opposite side of the room. The young woman watches the little girl sleeping soundly with her teddy bear and laments that suffering is so unfair to such a young child too. After all, she is a girl of only 5 years of age, who does not even have a name, and who just lost her biological father in the slave cage. The young woman's suffering also began early, as she painfully remembers the day her own father sold her for a single rabbit pelt. On the very first day she arrived at that same isolated cabin in the forest, before she could even unpack her few belongings, she was brutally mistreated by her late husband. The reason for that terrible mistreatment was simply the fact that she was running late and arrived a little after the agreed time. Realizing that this miserable existence was only just beginning, the young woman felt all her hopes crushed by that awful reality. On that occasion, she ended up fainting on the cabin floor after being hurt by her late partner. It was at that moment that the little blonde girl approached slowly and with much fear upon seeing the young woman down and injured on the cold floorboards. In that painful memory, the young woman remained down on the wooden floor, suffering from physical pain and the deep sadness of the assault. In the middle of that absolute nightmare of a cabin, the little blonde girl watched her with a sweet look full of compassion. Without hesitation, the little one sat right next to the injured young woman to offer her some comfort. The young woman realized that, in that whole terrible situation, the only person who showed affection and came close to her was that angelic little girl. Sometime later, the abusive husband went up into the mountains and never returned, leaving the two of them completely alone in the cabin. According to the rumors spread by the villagers, the man ended up being eaten by wolves in the hunting grounds and would never return. Although she felt an immense relief upon learning about the abuser's passing, the young woman could not help but feel great anxiety regarding their future. The fear of the unknown continued to haunt the young woman's thoughts as she reflected on the difficulties of living without a man's protection. She knew very well that, in that cruel society, a woman who had no husband was just as vulnerable as a lost sheep outside the fence. Back in the present, the young woman walks hand in hand with the little girl along a grassy trail toward the village. As they walk under the daylight, the little girl notices some strange movement and points excitedly to the road ahead. She tells her mother that a prisoner cart is approaching the area. The young woman watches the metal vehicle approach, having no idea who could be locked up inside. The two of them keep walking calmly toward the cart to see up close what is happening. Looking through the iron bars, the young woman is in absolute shock as she recognizes the young man to whom she had given the piece of bread. Her eyes widen in terror as she notices a frightening detail that triggers a traumatic memory in her mind. The scene of the young man holding a fork instantly reminds her of the cruel assaults by her late husband, who used to beat her while calling her worthless. The terrible memory of the man shouting that she was just making a drama while mistreating her comes back in full force inside her head. She remembers when he would throw the silverware on the floor and complain that she had ruined his appetite, leaving the two of them huddled and terrified in the corner of the room. Emotionally shaken, the young woman focuses her gaze on that metal fork in the cage, reliving all the pain and fear she thought she had left behind. The young woman remains frozen, watching the young man in the cage while trying to control her own feelings and painful memories. She decides to place the wicker basket containing 2 round loaves of bread on the ground, which she had brought for the welcoming standing beside the little girl. The young woman makes a quick decision and resolves to help the imprisoned young man. Carefully, she takes one of the warm loaves of bread to offer it directly to the young man in need. Upon receiving the food from her hands, the prota lets the fork drop to the floor and stares at her with a mix of surprise and deep gratitude. Suddenly, the young woman is interrupted by the voice of the village elder, who approaches asking if the guards have arrived yet. The older man takes the basket of food and tells the young woman to return to the village immediately, since he and the other men will take care of welcoming the soldiers. Without questioning the order, she calls the little girl to leave, but she cannot help taking one last look in the direction of the young man in the cage. The little blonde girl also walks in silence while looking back, seeming curious about the young man's situation. Alone again behind bars, the prota stares at the bread in his hands with a sad and thoughtful expression. Being very hungry, he takes a bite of the food at the exact moment. A metallic noise warns that the cage door is being opened. 2 heavily armed guards shout in their unknown language, roughly ordering the prisoners to step out of the cart. The prota is pulled out in an extremely violent manner and ends up falling face first onto the dirt ground. He groans in pain from the impact of the fall, while his stomach growls loudly due to the built-up hunger from so many days. The soldiers make the 3 enslaved men kneel on the ground before the village elder to begin a mysterious procedure. To the young man's surprise, one of the guards uses a sharp blade to cut the prisoner's wrists, causing blood to spill. The prisoner's blood begins to drip onto the grass while the soldier brings old papers with mysterious inscriptions over the cuts. In that same instant, the blood-stained papers begin to glow with an intense bluish aura, leaving the young man completely in shock as he realizes that this is real magic. The prota lets out a long, tired sigh, feeling totally lost and wondering what kind of bizarre world he has ended up in. Right after, one of the soldiers approaches the village elder and whispers something confidential in his ear about the prisoners. The elder listens carefully to the guard's report while glancing sideways at the prota, who remains kneeling on the grass. The young man is left confused, not understanding why he is the center of attention for those mysterious men. A little later, the sun shines brightly over the village and the isolated cabin in the forest where the women await news. Inside the cabin, an elderly lady from the village places a sack of supplies on the floor and warns that the village will continue providing food for some time. The old woman explains roughly that the young woman's future husband does not know the local language and that she will have to pay for all that help later on. She confesses that the village hated the late abusive husband and that they only accepted him because they lacked a hunter to watch over the mountains. The elderly lady adds that the new suitor must be very different from the previous one, since the soldiers mentioned he might be a commoner. She reports that despite his rustic appearance, the prisoner's feet and hands are as delicate and soft as a nobleman's. The old woman holds the young woman's hands and tries to reassure her by saying that his hands have never harmed anyone, promising that the two of them will live well if he works hard at hunting. The young woman looks down shyly and confesses that she does not care about having a life of luxury or riches. Her only and biggest concern is simply that her new partner is not a violent man like the late one. She caresses the little girl and says she would be satisfied if he just let the two of them live in peace in a corner of the house. Suddenly, loud knocks on the door startle the women, while the elder's voice orders them to open the cabin entrance. The young woman turns around in fear while protecting the little blonde girl who continues to sleep on her lap through the cabin window. The silhouette of the elder can be seen accompanied by an extremely tall man outside. The elder throws open the wooden door and announces in a loud voice that he has brought the man the young woman will marry. The young woman feels her heart race with anxiety upon hearing that her new husband is about to enter the home. The prota slowly enters the cabin and looks around with deep suspicion, having no idea what he is being pulled into now. Looking at the young man who just entered, the young woman's eyes widen in shock as she recognizes that he is the same injured prisoner from the cart. She is left completely speechless upon realizing that this sickly, mysterious, enslaved man will be her new husband. Seeing the young man up close, the young woman is totally intimidated by his impressive size, as she had never seen anyone so big in her entire life. The prota notices she is staring at him and looks back at her in a confused manner. Suddenly, he recognizes her and realizes that this young woman is the same generous person who had offered him a piece of bread when he was locked in the cage. However, the prota notices that she is trembling with fear in an inexplicable way and tries to understand the reason for such deep distress. The village elder breaks the silence and pulls the prota's arm, asking why he keeps standing there doing nothing. The old man drags the prota closer to the young woman while impatiently ordering the two of them to get close already. The two of them feel extremely awkward and embarrassed at being placed face to face in such a sudden and forced way. The elder complains about their shy and tense behavior, reminding them that the two are about to marry and should not act so coldly without wasting time. The old man firmly takes the hands of both and forces them together before everyone in the room. The old man celebrates happily upon seeing them holding hands, excitedly claiming that the two already look like a real couple. Not understanding the exact words, but perfectly catching the meaning of that embarrassing situation, the prota begins to suspect something unbelievable. He instantly remembers the insane words of the strange Santa, who had promised to find a pure-hearted wife and a beautiful daughter for him. The young man looks at the young woman and realizes she perfectly fits the description of a bride, as gentle and affectionate as a rabbit. Next, he looks at the wide-eyed little blonde girl and realizes she is exactly the cute and charming daughter he had asked for. The prota panics as he realizes that the crazy Santa was real and truly granted the wish from the bottom of his heart. However, he becomes deeply annoyed upon realizing that to grant the wish, the old man had to send him to a completely unknown medieval reality. He remembers all the pain of being treated like property in the cart and wonders if it was truly necessary to make him suffer so much just to deliver the gift. The prota lowers his head as a quiet, overwhelming rage begins to take over his entire being. Gritting his teeth in anger, the young man swears to himself that if he ever encounters that wretched Santa again, he will definitely end the old man's life. He radiates a furious aura that scares the young bride and the little girl, who tremble with fear at the terrifying expression of their new partner. In the middle of a clearing in the forest, the village elder talks energetically with other local residents around the prota. The young man watches that side conversation with irritation, thinking he is almost losing his mind from not being able to understand a single word they say. The elder listens to what the residents have to say, and then turns back in the direction of the prota. Suddenly, one of the village men approaches and extends his hand to the young man, making him think the guy just wants a friendly handshake. The two give a strong handshake to seal that initial meeting. However, the prota notices that the villager is breaking into a cold sweat and trembling intensely, which makes him question if people in this world usually greet others by crushing their hands. The young man focuses his gaze on the guy and is quite intrigued by such an over-the-top physical reaction to a simple greeting. Unable to bear the prota's monstrous strength, the villager drops to his knees on the ground, howling in pain and clutching his injured hand. The elder approaches in a hurry and gestures in a frightened manner, while the other man keeps crying on the ground, leaving the prota totally confused by the situation. To end that confusion, the old man approaches carrying a bow and an arrow, while the other villager keeps massaging his painful fingers. The elder then extends the rustic hunting weapon directly to the prota. The young man accepts the wooden bow and tries to guess the reason for it, noticing from the peaceful atmosphere that the old man is not trying to pick a fight. Suddenly, the elder bends down and places his hands on his head, making an extremely bizarre and funny pose. The old man begins to take small hops, imitating the ears and movements of a rabbit, leaving the prota with a grumpy face as he tries to decode that mime. The young man finally understands the message and realizes the elder wants him to learn how to hunt animals in the forest. At that exact moment, the elder abruptly stops hopping and widens his eyes as he spots something in the middle of the bushes. He points loudly in the direction of the vegetation and shouts for the prota to pay attention to the target. Right nearby, a cute little white rabbit calmly chews on some green leaves, completely unaware of the danger. The elder begins to yell desperately for the prota to shoot already, but the young man panics because he has never held a bow in his entire life. He kneels with difficulty and tries to aim at the rabbit, remembering having heard on Olympic broadcasts that it is nearly impossible for a beginner to make an arrow fly straight, which makes him doubt his ability to hit the target at such a great distance. The prota concentrates all his strength and finally releases the bowstring, firing the arrow toward the rabbit. However, the shot grazes past and hits the ground far from the rabbit, which just looks startled, not understanding what almost hit it. Even with the obvious miss, the elder begins to celebrate in a flamboyant way, leaving the prota totally puzzled as to how that failure became a reason to party. The old man keeps shouting and praising the prota in his native language, while the young man prefers to look away, feeling quite embarrassed by the whole situation. Sometime later, the young bride and the little girl walk through the forest hand in hand, accompanied by another female resident of the village. The prota senses someone approaching and quickly turns his face to see who it is. He feels sweat drip down his face as he notices his new bride is coming in his direction under the soft sunlight. The young man watches the young woman walk calmly with the child and tries to process the unbelievable idea that this woman is now his bride. He feels his own heartbeat faster and his cheeks flush as he looks directly at the young woman. The prota tries to hide his massive embarrassment, while the village elder chats in a relaxed manner with the young woman. Later on, everyone gathers in the clearing and spreads a large white cloth on the grass to have a meal together outdoors. The young bride, in a very thoughtful manner, serves a bowl of hot stew and hands it gently to the prota. The prota watches with his mouth watering at that delicious portion of stew filled with vegetables and generous chunks of meat. He begins to savor the food eagerly, while the young woman and the little girl watch him eat in silence. The speed at which the young man devours the food leaves the bride quite surprised, while the little girl shyly huddles up as she lies on her lap. The prota stops eating for a moment and stares at the two of them with a serious and reflective expression. Suddenly, he sets his seriousness aside and flashes a genuinely sweet and friendly smile to try to reassure them both. While enjoying that picnic in the forest, the young man remembers that the word family was always something distant for him. From his school days until he turned 30 years of age, he watches the young woman and the little girl eating together and feels a deep gratitude for finally being given a home with whom to share his life. Even knowing it would have been better if everything happened naturally, the prota concludes that after all the hardships he faced in this new world, the order of events does not matter in the slightest. Looking up at the clear sky, the prota thinks with sarcasm that he feels like strangling that Santa, but at the same time, another feeling is rising. He observes his new wife and adopted daughter and silently offers a sincere thank you for receiving this very special gift. Already by the next day, things begin to move at a fast pace as they walk together along a trail in the middle of the forest. Carrying a giant bag on his back, the young man looks back with concern, wondering if the two are managing to keep up with him without difficulty. He notices that both the young woman and the little girl are panting and exhausted from the tiring walk under the sun. The prota feels extremely frustrated at not being able to even ask if they are okay, due to the massive language barrier. He sets it in his mind that he needs to learn to communicate and adapt to this new world as quickly as possible to help his family. Determined to take action, the young man halts his steps and stops walking in the middle of the road. He remembers his late mother's advice once again, which said that when there is someone we wish to protect, we must never hesitate under any circumstances. The memory of his mother's smiling face reinforces the idea that he must act immediately as soon as he feels the need to protect those he loves, with a new determination shining in his eyes. The prota turns back toward where the two of them are. He walks with firm steps toward the young woman and the little girl, who watch him in surprise. Upon seeing the giant man approach, the little blonde girl begins to whimper in fear and shiver at his presence. The young man patiently kneels down to their height and says in a gentle voice that he is going to hold them for a moment, asking them not to be scared. Even without understanding his words, the bride steps back in fear and stares at him with her eyes wide in terror. She joins her hands in a plea and begins to beg in her language, leaving the prota quite confused by that defensive reaction. The little girl also begins to cry loudly, thinking that something bad is about to happen to the two of them. The young man realizes that his serious expression might look intimidating and regrets that they get so terrified just by his approach. Trying to be as gentle as possible, he says, "Excuse me," and extends his strong arms toward the two of them. Without giving them time to keep suffering from tiredness, the prota uses all his monstrous strength to lift both the bride and the little girl off the ground at once, leaving them completely bewildered. The young woman lets out a gasp of surprise at being suddenly lifted by the young man, not understanding how he possesses such physical ease without showing any effort. The young man tucks the bride under one of his arms and the little girl under the other to resume the walk. The Prota raises his head firmly, carrying the two of them in an extremely secure and protective manner through the woods. Clinging to the large supply bag on his back, the little blonde girl lets out a murmur of amazement at that unexpected ride. The little girl focuses her gaze on the ground far below and is marveled by the height at which she is being carried by her new protector. The Prota quietly tells the young woman to hold on tight, causing her to rest her hand on his shoulder with much shyness. He begins to jog down the trail and realizes that even while carrying both of them and all the heavy luggage, they seem way too light and make no difference on his back at all. Thinking of their well-being, the young man decides he needs to learn the local language and hunting techniques quickly to be able to feed them plenty of meat. While the young woman watches him with a much sweeter and more grateful look, the Prota reflects in silence that his routine will be extremely busy from now on. In a gesture of pure affection, the young woman quietly steps closer and uses a handkerchief to wipe the sweat dripping down the Prota's face. He gets a huge surprise from that delicate and unexpected touch, halting his steps for a brief instant. The two share a deep look full of tenderness in the middle of the forest, narrowing a bit of the emotional distance that existed between them. The young man resumes the path with quick steps, following the elder who walks much further ahead to guide them to the residence. Upon finally reaching the destination, the Prota gives a respectful bow and thanks the old man for showing the way to the cabin. The elder just turns his back and leaves, leaving the new family alone in front of their new home. The Prota observes the worn structure of the cabin and concludes that this place will probably be even colder than the small rooftop room where he used to live. He shivers all over as he remembers the suffering he went through in the iron cage, grumbling mentally about how much he has always hated the cold with all his might. Wishing to enter quickly to shelter himself from the wind, he extends his hand and pushes the rustic wooden door of the cabin. However, the Prota is surprised and lets out a murmur of amazement upon opening the door and looking inside. He comes across his bride already standing in the middle of the room, staring at him with eyes bright with anticipation and surprise at his arrival. Seeing that his new bride is crying silently inside the cabin, the Prota approaches out of concern and asks in his own language the reason for such deep sadness. However, unable to comprehend what he says, the young woman runs out the front door in tears, leaving the Prota completely confused. The young man immediately turns to watch the young woman flee, but ends up noticing something strange inside the cabin. He stands frozen in the doorway as he notices the place is entirely deserted and devoid of any basic furniture or utensils. The Prota realizes that while he was handling things in the village, the residents took absolutely everything from the house, including the shelves, the table, the work tools, and even the hunting weapons. He worries immensely about the arrival of the harsh winter and realizes that without any weapon nearby, he will have no way to defend the two if some wild animal appears to attack them. The young man walks through the forest and finally finds the young woman crying, curled up on the grass, calmly approaching as he says he finally found her. Taking his time, he sits down next to her on the ground to try to offer some comfort in the middle of that moment of despair. The Prota extends his large hand and rests it with extreme gentleness upon the young woman's head, who stares back at him with her face bathed in tears. He begins to stroke her hair in a loving way, trying to convey security through his gentle touch. The young man quietly asks her not to worry, making the young woman wonder internally if he is really trying to calm her down somehow. She stares at the young man with teary eyes and reflects on the fact that this unknown man is now her new partner in life. The young woman ponders with anguish that they cannot communicate, and that, despite being a mountain inhabitant, he does not even know how to hunt to get food. She watches him with suspicion and wonders if they will truly be capable of surviving together in such a hostile and dangerous environment. However, the young woman's tense expression begins to soften as she notices the serene and welcoming smile that appears on the young man's lips. The Prota promises in his own language that he will protect her from everything, sparking a strange sense of calm inside the young woman amid so many doubts and fears. With much affection, he brings his hand close and gently holds the young bride's face to comfort her for good. One last tear streams down her face at the exact moment she feels the warmth and security of that touch under the golden glow of twilight in the forest. The two remain very close to one another while the young man calms his partner's anxious heart. The young woman observes the reflection of the two of them in the water and wonders, surprised, the reason she is feeling such a great relief in her chest after the arrival of this mysterious man. Ju-won remembers that in his original world, he was left completely alone since the day his parents passed away. even with so much loneliness. He fought hard and stood firm to manage to survive no matter what. Now that he finally has a family, the young man feels there is no reason at all not to endure any hardship. While Lizzie watches him in silence, Juwon thumps his chest with confidence and promises he will do whatever it takes to support and care for them. Upon hearing those welcoming words, the young woman cannot hold back her emotion and breaks down in tears. Lizzie leans against her fiancé's chest to cry, leaving him surprised by that very sudden reaction. At that moment, the little blonde girl comes running desperately toward them, shouting in her own language for Juwon not to hurt Lizzie. The little one runs to stand in front of her adoptive mother and stretches out her little arms, begging him not to mistreat her. Faced with all that despair, the young man pulls them both into a loving embrace in the middle of the forest. Juwon reflects on that unusual situation, feeling the weight of having a weeping woman in his arms. Seeing the little girl sobbing right by his side, he realizes just how new and strange this whole concept of having a family is to him. Suddenly, several doubts cross his mind, making him wonder whose child that is and the reason Lizzie had given him food before. He also tries to understand what made her so sad to the point of crying like that in the past. Despite so many unanswered questions, he feels that if they keep living and striving together, they will definitely become a real family. The young man silently promises he will make them happier than anyone else, swearing he will never let them cry from sadness again and that he will become a good husband and a good father. He wishes from the bottom of his heart that neither of them ever regrets entering his life. Time passes and the sun begins to set over the small wooden cabin isolated in the forest. Inside the residence, Lizzie and the little girl sit huddled on the floor near the empty shelves, maintaining a safe distance from Juwon. The young man sits on the other side and feels a bit discouraged, realizing that despite having hugged outside, they seem to have gone back to square one regarding intimacy. Even so, he feels relieved to notice that the two seem merely cautious rather than terrified, and begins to plan what he should do first to start this new routine. Suddenly, an idea strikes Juwon's mind, making him let out a sound of surprise while pointing to himself. He quickly scoots closer to the two of them, but the sudden movement ends up startling Lizzie and the little girl, who take a little leap back to calm them down. The young man points to his own chest and says his name out loud, introducing himself as Kim Juwon. He repeats his name in a very paused manner so they can understand, thinking that even without speaking the same language, they at least need to know each other's names to live together from then on. Lizzie is surprised to hear such a different name and tries to babble the words very slowly to see if she can learn it. With a friendly smile, the young man extends his hand toward her and gestures, asking her to also tell him what she is called. After hesitating for a few seconds, the young woman takes a deep breath and tries to pronounce her own name, saying very quietly that her name is Lizzie Juwon, repeats her name to engrave it well in his memory, and feels completely delighted to finally establish a line of communication. He praises it, saying it is a very beautiful name, leaving Lizzie not knowing what to say and quite shy at that unexpected compliment. Next, the young man turns to the little blonde girl and asks what her name is with a very gentle voice. But the little one huddles up completely out of shyness. Lizzie and the little girl just look at each other in silence, which leaves Juwon confused by that awkward atmosphere that suddenly formed. He carefully observes the child's reaction and realizes that she probably does not have a real name yet. The young man feels a bit sad at this discovery, while the little blonde girl makes a pouting face. Sensing that the mood has changed, Juwon then extends his hand lovingly to stroke her golden hair and decides that he will give a name to the girl himself. He chooses the name Dorothy, remembering a famous story from his own world that closely resembles their new journey. The young man thinks that he wants her to be strong like Dorothy from The Wizard of Oz, the one who travels through unknown paths and makes true friends. He hopes the little one finds her own happiness and grows up surrounded by love and dear people throughout her life. The little girl points to herself and tries to repeat the new name very slowly, while Juwon confirms with a smile that this name will bring her many good things. Dorothy opens a massive, radiant smile upon finally gaining her own identity that she can carry with pride. The next day, in the middle of the forest under the twilight glow, Juwon is already working hard, chopping firewood with his immense physical strength. Watching the young man work, Lizzie reflects in silence on how much she thinks Juwon is a truly strange man. She notices that even though he has a massive body and hands much larger than her late husband's, he treats her with great kindness instead of harming her. The young woman feels he is totally different from everyone she has met up to this day, as if he belonged to a completely new type of people. She whispers Juhwan's name to herself, thinking that the pronunciation sounds very refined and that his tone of voice is incredibly soft, even without her knowing that language. Reminded of her difficult past, she recalls that never before in her life had she received even a single gesture of affection or kindness from anyone. Lizzie asks herself with a confused heart what the real reason could be for this unknown man to be so good and protective toward her. Ju-won notices something and turns around a bit confused, while Lizzie thinks that no matter how hard she tries to understand, he simply does not seem to belong to that simple place. Upon spotting the young woman from afar, the young man opens a huge smile and waves cheerfully, calling out Lizzie's name. She focuses her attention on his black hair and dark eyes, remembering some old stories she has already heard in the village. She recalls the rumors about a distant country that was at war and that supposedly managed to perform a legendary summoning to bring a hero to their world. According to the legend discussed by people, this great summoned warrior would happen to have black hair and striking dark eyes. Seeing Ju-hwan walk calmly in her direction, the young woman cannot help but notice the immense physical presence he commands. She takes a close look at his features and begins to think that her fiancé's characteristics really resemble those of that legendary hero from the rumors a bit. However, she quickly dismisses the idea, thinking it impossible that such an important warrior would be hidden there, tending to an isolated mountain in a humble village instead of being in a grand palace. After all, that was nothing more than village gossip and rumors that no one could truly prove. When the young man approaches for good and stops very close to her, the young woman lets out a slight sigh of surprise at the sudden physical proximity. Looking at him up close, Lizzie notices that his hair and eyes are actually a very dark shade of brown and not completely black like in the legend. She lets out a relieved sigh upon concluding that he is just a very large and strong man, but quickly startles herself as she catches her own thoughts. The young woman is left confused, not understanding why she felt relief at that, since the two met on that exact day and still barely know each other. She begins to shake her head and blush with embarrassment to push away those crazy thoughts, leaving Ju-hwan completely bewildered by that funny reaction. Suddenly, Ju-hwan places his hand on Lizzie's head and begins to give her a very gentle head pat, catching the young woman completely by surprise. With her heart racing, she realizes she is not used to receiving this type of affection at all. In Lizzie's past, the only reason a man would place his hand on her head was to harm her physically, which leaves her tense for a moment. However, his touch remains extremely light and affectionate, sliding smoothly through her hair. She begins to relax her eyes and feels a very good and comforting sensation, internally wishing that he would continue with that affection for a longer time. While Ju-won watches her with a warm look, the young woman surrenders to that sweet moment, hoping he will not stop caressing her. Looking deep into her eyes, the young man begins to get extremely flushed and embarrassed by the physical proximity. Lizzie stares at him with an expression so serene and gentle that it makes his heart race even faster. Carried away by the emotion of the moment, Ju-won leans in and seals Lizzie's lips with a very passionate kiss. Under the golden light of late afternoon, Lizzie widens her eyes, completely shocked, unable to believe what is happening. At that exact second, Ju-won suddenly realizes the impulsive move he made and opens his eyes, startled by his own gesture. The young man immediately backs away, all red and clumsy, while Lizzie stands totally frozen and cold as an ice statue from sheer embarrassment. The atmosphere becomes extremely awkward, and neither of them knows where to look, causing the young man to stammer without managing to utter a single word. Desperate to escape that embarrassing situation, Ju-won spots a wooden bucket on the ground and decides to use it as an excuse to get out of there. He quickly extends his arm and grabs the bucket handle firmly all at once. Without looking back, the young man runs off like a madman toward the forest, leaving Lizzie standing in the same spot with a look of astonishment. Alone in the clearing, the young woman feels her face burning from so much embarrassment and brings her hand to her chest, trying to calm her heart that beats wildly out of rhythm. As he walks down the dark trail carrying the bucket, Ju-won scolds himself mentally, thinking he has completely lost his mind and wondering what Lizzie must be thinking of him now. He places his hand on his head in regret, reminding himself that even though they were forced to marry, they just met on that very same day. The young man is left not knowing what to do since they cannot even talk to each other, considering if the best way out would be to simply act as if nothing had happened. Ju-hwan halts his steps in the middle of the dark woods, trying to calm down and focus on what truly matters at that moment. Looking around, he realizes he has gone too deep into the forest and finds himself totally lost, not knowing where he is or what path to follow back. Strange and frightening noises begin to echo from between the tree branches, making the environment even tenser. The young man decides he needs to find water quickly to fill the bucket and run back to the cabin before it gets any later. However, he gets a huge fright upon hearing a violent growl coming from very close by. Turning around slowly, he comes face to face with a massive creature with red eyes glowing in the darkness. It is a giant, wild wolf, showing its sharp, salivating fangs. Ready to attack the young man, Juan swallows hard and begins to tremble from head to toe, realizing he is in deep trouble without any weapon to defend himself. The young man backs away as he sees the size of the beast, unable to believe he is standing in front of such a dangerous predator. Instinctively, he slowly crouches down to the ground to try to reach a thick piece of wood he found lying on the grass. He extends his trembling hand and grips the piece of wood with all the strength he has. At the exact moment he stands up, the giant wolf lunges in a deadly leap in his direction, letting out a terrifying roar. Juan uses the piece of wood to block the attack, and the beast sinks its sharp fangs directly into the improvised log. With his adrenaline at the limit, the young man lets out a battle cry and raises his other fist with all his colossal strength. He delivers a devastating punch directly to the wild wolf's face, making the animal let out a yelp of pain. Despite the powerful blow, the predator insists on keeping its bite on the piece of wood, leaving the young man furious at the creature's persistence. He shouts, saying he will not pass away in that place no matter what, and begins to deliver more violent punches against the wolf. With his eyes glowing a blue shade from the strength and fury, the young man shouts that he definitely will not give up on his new life. He lands a brutal and final blow on the creature, splashing blood across the foliage while the animal finally backs away wounded. Right after the combat, Juan collapses and shouts in agony, feeling an unbearable pain take over his entire body, as if he were catching fire from the inside. The giant wolf lets out one more deafening howl and tries to bite Juan again with its sharp jaws. However, the young man is left totally bewildered as he sees that actual flames of fire begin to cover the animal's body and his own arms. Juan stares at his own arm wrapped in burning blazes, without feeling any burn on his skin. While the predator begins to whine in pain, he takes advantage of the animal's moment of weakness to pin it down with absolute force, while the fire continues to consume the wolf. With a furious shout, the young man delivers one more powerful blow coated in flames right to the beast's head. Juan keeps punching the animal without stopping until ensuring the danger has been completely neutralized. The wolf drops to the ground, totally lifeless and emitting smoke, leaving a pool of blood on the forest grass. Exhausted, the young man collapses onto his back on the grass and grows thoughtful, trying to understand what just happened and how his arm caught fire that way. He raises his hand to examine his own skin and notices, confused, that there are no burn marks and not even his clothes were damaged by the flames. He touches his own face, shocked at the possibility of having just used some kind of real fire magic. The young man remembers that the idea of falling into a different world and suddenly gaining incredible superpowers is something very common in fiction stories. He reflects on how these fantasy novel cliches seem to be happening for real to him. Now decided to test this crazy theory, the young man extends his open hand upward and prepares to try to conjure something. He points his arm up with determination and shouts for the classic fireball spell to see if it works. However, he shouts the name of the spell several times in a row in the middle of the deserted forest and nothing happens, leaving only an awkward silence in the air without giving up. The young man begins to shout other names of moves like Firestorm and Firewall in the hope of activating his power. He keeps trying every type of magical phrase, from Dragon's Breath to invoking the fire spirits, but the forest remains completely calm and silent. The young man gives up and lets out a disappointed sigh, but realizes that fight was not an illusion, and notices his wounds seem to have healed on their own because of that energy. He concludes that if he can master and use this ability whenever he wants, it will definitely be of great help to hunt and support his family. Juan smiles as he imagines the future, thinking about how he will be able to give a decent life, quality food, and lots of happiness to Lizzie and little Dorothy. Juan also realizes that this healing magic can be extremely useful to treat his family immediately, since there are no doctors in the mountain village. He resolves to walk back home, thinking about everything calmly, knowing that if it happened once, it will definitely happen again in the future. Juan remembers his sad past, recalling that shortly after his parents' passing, his beloved grandfather, who was very healthy, also ended up passing away in a terrible accident. At the funeral, one of his relatives lunged at him with violence, delivering blows and shouting in anger that the tragedy was entirely his fault. The man kept accusing the fallen boy of being the cause of his family members' deaths simply for living under the same roof as them. Back then, when Juan was just a middle school student, all his relatives began to look at him with absolute contempt and hatred. They treated him as if he were a cursed plague that brought destruction wherever he went, a painful memory that still hurts the young man's heart. Back in the present, the young man focuses on the dead wolf and thinks it would be better to skin the animal right there, but gives up upon remembering that blood can attract other dangerous predators. Ju-wan throws the heavy body of the giant wolf over his shoulders and decides to walk quickly toward his cabin so as not to delay himself even further in the darkness. He reflects that the lessons from his late grandfather on how to slaughter chickens and rabbits correctly on the farm would be so useful to him in the middle of that forest. Under the bluish glow of the full moon, the young man walks, feeling that his grandfather would be extremely proud to see him so strong and protective like that. Despite this, the young man wonders with curiosity how he will go about training and mastering his new fire magic powers from then on. Meanwhile, in the comfort of the cabin, Lizzie and little Dorothy try to tidy up the interior of the room, warmed by the fireplace fire. The little girl runs over very excited and smiling toward Lizzie, bringing an empty bowl in her hands to help with the organization. The young camponesa smiles with tenderness and thanks little Dorothy for being so helpful in tidying up their new home. Dorothy closes her little eyes and lets out a super cute giggle upon receiving the gentle head pat. The little girl begins to play around the cabin, but ends up stopping near the entrance as she notices something strange coming from outside. Moved by curiosity, Dorothy slowly approaches and peeks through a small crack in the door's wood to see what is happening in the forest. However, she widens her little golden eyes in terror upon coming across a terrible scene right before her. Another huge and hungry wild wolf is standing right outside, staring directly at the girl, making Dorothy let out a desperate cry of panic. Lizzie hears Dorothy's desperate cry and turns around in fear, coming face to face with the giant wolf's head right at the cabin window. Without hesitating for a second, the young woman runs to the table and grabs a very sharp kitchen knife to try to defend the girl. She charges forward with determination and shouts for Dorothy to move away from there immediately to stay safe. However, she widens her eyes in shock as she looks closer at the outside of the cabin. Lizzie realizes it was not a wolf attack, but rather Ju-wan carrying the massive carcass of the slain predator on his back while grumbling from tiredness. Seeing the young man carry that immense weight, she opens the door and runs hurriedly to meet him to help him in any way. Ju-wan collapses to his knees and drops the wolf's body onto the grass, while Lizzie shouts desperately for his name. The two run in his direction, thinking he is gravely injured, leaving the young man quite confused by such a desperate reaction. She stops suddenly in shock upon seeing that the huge wolf is completely dead, and that the young man has no visible serious injury. Relieved upon realizing that everything was nothing more than a big misunderstanding, the knife slips from Lizzie's hand and falls directly onto the grass. In despair, Lizzie kneels beside him and begins to examine his body with trembling hands, while Ju-wan tries to reassure her, saying he is fine now, despite having hurt himself a little earlier. Little Dorothy also approaches crying hard and hugs his leg, showing all her worry for their new protector. Ju-wan holds his fiancé's hands lovingly and tells a little lie, saying he just took a silly bite to the arm and that he is already fully recovered under the glow of the full moon. He caresses them both and guarantees once more that they do not need to worry about him. Lizzie lets out a sigh of relief and suddenly hugs the young man with great force, leaving Ju-wan totally surprised and extremely flushed by the gesture. She cries with emotion pressed against his chest, and the young man tries to decode the words she repeats without stopping, deducing she must be saying how relieved she is. Dorothy also clings to him in tears, letting out murmurs in her language that seemed to mean she was dying of fear of losing him. Seeing the two crying from worry because of him, Ju-wan feels a tightening in his chest and remembers the promise he made to himself never to make them cry from sadness again. The next day, dawn arrives at the mountain, and a crow caws from the top of the cabin roof, bringing a calmer atmosphere after the busy night with the day clear. Ju-wan places the huge wolf on a wooden workbench, and begins the meticulous work of skinning and cleaning the animal using his knife. Ju-wan makes a precise cut in the wolf's thick skin, carefully separating the hide from the reddish meat. He lets out a tired sigh upon realizing that, although it seemed very easy when his grandfather did it, performing the work alone is taking much more time than expected. Thinking that the task is really quite tiring, the young man concludes he will need to try a different and more practical method the next time he skins an animal. Decided to finish everything soon, he goes back to cutting the meat into smaller pieces when suddenly he hears someone call his name, looking in the direction of the entrance. He sees Lizzie's silhouette calmly approaching his workspace. He turns around surprised and wonders in thought if it really is his bride coming over there. Ju-wan walks cheerfully in her direction and calls out Lizzie's name, who brings with her a large empty wooden bucket. Without saying a word, the young woman places the bucket on the ground and gestures for the young man to put the pieces of meat inside it. With very cute and simple gestures, Lizzie explains that the bucket serves to store and carry the food, making Ju-wan finally understand the message. Wanting to show his gratitude for her help, the young man places his hand on his chin and tries desperately to remember what the word for thank you was in that language. The young man stammers a bit and risks saying thank you in her language, leaving Lizzie quite surprised at his attempt to communicate. Upon hearing the thank you, a gentle and very beautiful smile appears spontaneously on the young Campanese's lips. Not completely understanding the reason for the smile, Ju-hwan grows thoughtful and wonders if he ended up pronouncing some word incorrectly. Lizzie points to the bucket and repeats the word of thanks with a cheerful voice, confirming that he spoke it perfectly right. She takes a sweet step in his direction, closing the physical distance between the two in the middle of the forest. They exchange a look filled with affection, and Lizzie thanks him again in a very gentle manner for his protective presence. Ju-hwan replies kindly that he is welcome, making Lizzie look away with her cheeks flushed from so much shyness. The young woman reflects on how that simple word of thanks was something she had never heard before from her parents or siblings throughout her life. She finds it incredible how minimal gestures, like just bringing a bucket to help him, make her feel so many new emotions for the first time by his side. While walking right behind Ju-hwan, the young woman also remembers with a racing heart that first and unforgettable touch of lips they shared. Just remembering that intimate approach, Lizzie's face heats up instantly, and she turns completely red from embarrassment. Although she feels extremely embarrassed by these thoughts, she cannot contain her own curiosity as she walks right behind him to the shed. The young woman begins to wonder if that was also his first time, or if he had already kissed other women in the past, questioning if the others felt this way near him. For some silly reason, her chest begins to tighten and she feels a bit confused with a racing heart and a slight urge to cry without explanation. Upon entering the wooden shed, Lizzie gets a small startle as she sees Ju-hwan adjusting the buckets and organizing the place. She finds it very unusual to see a man take care of that part of the organization, since normally in the region it was the women who took care of gathering the meat. She steps closer to help and wonders why he acts with such natural ease, as if dividing household chores were the most obvious thing in the world. However, as they move together to store the meat, the two end up closing in too much and exchange a surprised look at the sudden proximity. Lizzie goes into an internal panic upon realizing Ju-hwan is very close, fearing he might resolve to kiss her again at that instant. Not knowing how to react, the young woman simply squeezes her eyes shut tightly and waits for what is to come. With her heart beating in her throat, Ju-hwan approaches very slowly toward Lizzie's face, who keeps her eyes closed, waiting for a move from him. However, instead of her lips, the young man places only a loving and gentle kiss on the young woman's forehead, catching her totally by surprise. She takes a step back, very embarrassed, calling him an idiot in thought, and wondering why on earth she closed her eyes like that. Ju-hwan holds the wooden bucket and stares at her without understanding absolutely anything. While the young woman looks away, dying of embarrassment, Lizzie goes into a mental despair, thinking she must have looked like a fool who was obviously begging for a kiss on the mouth. But the young man just takes one more sweet step in her direction, with a kind and warm smile on his face, leaving her confused. She fills herself with courage and decides that this time she will not close her eyes no matter what, so as not to create any more silly misunderstandings between them. To her surprise, Ju-hwan leans in lovingly and seals Lizzie's lips with a real kiss, making her heart race. He backs away slowly with an extremely tender look and a serene smile, leaving the young Campanesa completely out of breath. The young man gathers the bucket with the meat and walks out of the shed calling for Dorothy, leaving Lizzie static and floating in her own romantic thoughts. Lizzie realizes that little Dorothy was peeking at everything from behind the door and goes into complete despair at the thought that the girl saw the kiss dying of so much embarrassment. The young woman runs out of there with long strides into the house, leaving Ju-hwan confused by that sudden flight. Sometime later, they walk back down the forest trail, with Lizzie walking much further ahead to avoid the young man. Ju-hwan carries the bucket with the meat, while little Dorothy walks by his side, holding the edge of the wood to try to help her new father. The young man looks at her with much affection and says, "Thank you," in his own language, with a massive smile on his face. Dorothy makes a confused and thoughtful expression, which makes Ju-hwan wonder if the reason for the reaction is because he did not call her by her new name. He then repeats the phrase pointing to her and calls her Dorothy, specifically thanking the girl for being a great helper. The little girl lets out an extremely happy laugh upon hearing her new name and continues helping to carry the bucket with much enthusiasm. Later, already inside the cabin, Lizzie sits on the floor and begins to stroke the soft hide of the slain wolf with a loving look. Ju-hwan watches her while sitting at a certain distance, finding it strange that she wants to dry that hide inside the house, since the smell of raw hide must be quite strong. The young man suddenly widens his eyes as he realizes what the bride's true plan is with that wolf hide. He realizes that this wolf hide is an extremely valuable and precious item for Lizzie to protect the family from the intense cold. Lizzie calls little Dorothy close to the wolf hide, encouraging her to approach without fear of the soft fur. The little blonde girl rests her head directly on the wolf's warm fur and lets out a delighted giggle at such a smooth texture. The two begin to laugh and play together with the soft hide, bringing an atmosphere of pure joy into the humble cabin. Ju-won watches them from afar with a calm and proud look, feeling happy to see that the little girl is finally having fun and smiling. The day dawns sunny in the mountains, bringing a new morning of much hard work and cooperation for the new family. On the inside, Lizzie begins to prepare the fresh pieces of wolf meat in a large, rustic wooden basin. Ju-won observes the process with much attention to learn to preserve the food correctly, thinking of doing the same alone on the next opportunity. He also notices how happy she gets upon seeing the clean fat from the meat and rejoices for having kept that part, thinking it would be useful in some way. Ju-won grows thoughtful upon realizing that there are still many new things he needs to learn and do to master the lifestyle of that world. He reflects on how the local economy works, how to buy and trade goods, wanting to master all of this as quickly as possible to ensure their livelihood. The young man decides he has rested enough and that it is time to get up and return to the heavy work in the forest. Seeing him move toward the exit, Lizzie gets startled and gestures in a hurried way, trying to stop him from exerting himself so much. Ju-won watches her gesture and tries to guess what she wants to say, wondering if she is asking him to stay seated resting. He shakes his head with a gentle smile and explains in his language that he is already feeling very well and that the injury does not hurt anymore. With a kind touch on her shoulder, the young man guarantees he will not commit any exaggeration in physical effort, asking her not to worry. Lizzie just watches him walk away in silence, still a bit apprehensive, but touched by his affectionate way. In the middle of the woods, Ju-won analyzes the trunk of a medium-sized tree, thinking it looks ideal to train his aim with the axe. He examines the shiny axe and remembers he heard that oak is great for firewood, deciding to trust in his immense physical strength to perform the cut even without ever having done it before. Ju-won raises the heavy axe high with both hands and prepares to deliver a powerful blow against the tree trunk. He holds the wooden handle with all the necessary firmness, concentrating all his uncommon physical strength for the impact. However, upon striking the trunk, the axe ends up breaking and the metal blade flies far away in a disastrous manner, leaving him startled. The young man feels extremely awkward at his own mistake, scratching his head and realizing he needs to learn to control his monstrous strength better. Twilight begins to appear on the horizon of the mountains, bringing a golden light that illuminates the entire wooden cabin. Ju-won opens the cabin door and enters carrying a basket full of chopped firewood on his back, tired after spending hours working in the forest. Seeing him enter carrying so much weight, Lizzie and little Dorothy widen their eyes in surprise and concern. Lizzie runs hurriedly in his direction and holds his arms tightly, afraid that he has overdone it in physical effort. She makes the young man sit on the floor all at once to rest, leaving Ju-won quite confused by all that excessive worry. The young woman begins to examine his hands and arms with much affection, making the young man smile awkwardly and guarantee he is perfectly fine. With a flushed face, Lizzie holds Ju-won's hands lovingly and whispers a thank you very quietly under the watchful eye of little Dorothy. Suddenly, the little girl turns around and goes running in a hurried way to the other side of the room, drawing everyone's attention. She runs to the bucket of fresh water and dips her chubby little hands with a lot of energy. Next, the little girl runs back in the young man's direction with quick and hopping steps. Dorothy then places her chilly little hands all at once on Ju-won's cheeks to cool him down, catching the couple totally by surprise. The young man feels the thermal shock of the cold water on his face and lets out a confused exclamation before starting to laugh at the girl's cute move. Seeing the funny scene, Lizzie cannot contain herself and lets out a very joyful laugh, making the mood in the cabin even lighter. The little blonde girl stares at him with her little eyes shining with expectation. Waiting to see if her new father liked the playful gesture, Ju-won crouches down lovingly and gently strokes her golden hair, sweetly thanking little Dorothy for the cute gesture. Excited with the affection, the little girl runs back to the bucket to get more water, making Ju-won wave in fear. Asking her to stop, Ju-won looks around the cozy cabin and thinks to himself that all that happiness and union seem even like a beautiful dream. He recalls that until a few days ago, he thought he would never experience such affection, promising in his heart that he will do everything to keep Lizzie and Dorothy's smiles always lit. Suddenly, a terrifying and violent howl echoes from outside the cabin, breaking the silence of the night on the mountain in a sudden manner. The sound makes the smoke from the chimney wobble in the cold air, bringing an immediate sense of imminent danger to the residents inside the house. The couple sups quietly at a low table while little Dorothy already sleeps deeply on her pillow on the floor. Upon hearing the strange noise outside, both interrupt their meal immediately and exchange a worried look. Fortunately, little Dorothy continues in her deep sleep, without noticing anything of what is happening around her. So as not to scare anyone, Ju-won tries to keep calm and smiles slightly to reassure Lizzie, even while being on maximum alert. With much care so as not to wake her, the young man bends down and lifts the sleeping little girl in his strong arms. He stands up, holding the little one in a protective way, while Lizzie begins to clear the table and prepares for whatever is out there. With very light steps, Ju-won walks toward the double bed to lay the sleeping little girl down with the maximum amount of care. He places her lying down on the pillow in a very affectionate way and covers her with the blanket to keep her well warmed. Through the cabin window, the dim light of a single candle illuminates the internal environment with a soft and cozy glow. Meanwhile, Lizzie dips a clean cloth into a pot with hot water at the hearth to prepare a compress. Ju-won approaches slowly and watches her work with the hot cloth, not understanding very well what she is about to do. Suddenly, the young woman extends her soft hands and holds his wrist with much delicacy, interrupting his thoughts. She holds his hand firmly and affectionately, looking deep into his eyes with an expression full of tenderness and worry. Ju-won feels his face heat up slightly, with the delicate touch of the bride, staring at her with a hint of doubt about what she intends to do next. Under the dim and romantic light of the room, the two remain very close to one another, sharing a moment of deep emotional connection with extreme delicacy. The young woman brings the warm cloth close and begins to clean with all the care the dirt from the face and neck of her beloved. She passes the warm cloth smoothly by the nape of his neck, taking care so that the young man feels very comfortable. With her heart beating hard, she tries to push away the nervousness, thinking that caring for him in that loving way is the natural role of a dedicated wife. With shyness, Lizzie slides her hand with the cloth under Ju-won's shirt to begin cleaning his abdomen. Upon feeling the warm touch on his stomach, the young man stares at her in a sweet way, leaving the two a bit embarrassed at such intimacy. Ju-won lets out a gentle and understanding smile, appreciating that affectionate care he had never received before. Lizzie backs away quickly with her face extremely red, feeling too embarrassed to continue with that intimate cleaning. However, the young man extends his arm lovingly and holds her hand together with the warm cloth, preventing her from moving away. He pulls her very close to himself with a gentle smile on his lips, making the young camponesa's heart give a leap of surprise. He leans in and whispers quietly in her ear for them to go lie down and rest once and for all, hand in hand. The two walk calmly toward the double bed under the comforting silence of the isolated cabin on the mountain. The two lie down side by side in the cozy bed, illuminated only by the mild glow of an oil lantern. Ju-won leans slightly over her and stares at her affectionately, making Lizzie's heart race again from so much shyness. With extreme delicacy, the young man begins to stroke the brown hair of his wife, conveying to her all the security she needs. Lizzie closes her eyes and lets escape a passionate sigh, feeling a happiness she never imagined to be possible. Ju-won seals the bride's lips with a calm kiss full of affection in the silence of the cabin. He hugs her in a protective way during the gentle kiss, thinking about how much her lips and touch are incredibly soft. Looking at little Dorothy, who sleeps peacefully, Ju-won realizes he now has a real wife and makes a silent appeal for those two never to depart before him. In thought, the young man begs Santa never to take them from his life and to allow them to continue happy until their last breath. He knows that the great lords and rich nobles probably would not understand that simplicity from living in giant castles filled with servants and empty rooms. However, in any home of simple people and peasants, it is very common for children to grow up sharing the same space and sleeping in the same room as the parents. Lizzie remembers with sadness that in a small house, children end up inevitably listening and knowing about everything that happens at night between the couple. She recalls with terror her difficult childhood, when the booming and threatening voice of her father used to terrorize the whole house before the violence. After her father finally slept, the girl stayed huddled in bed, listening to the muffled sobs of her mother crying in pain until dawn. All that constant violence made Lizzie live immersed in a deep and endless fear. She spent the nights awake wondering when she would finally have peace, dying of fear that the sad destiny of suffering of her mother would become her own future. The next day, the young camponesa begins to open her eyes slowly to the soft sound of something crackling nearby. Lizzie realizes that the comforting sound of firewood burning slowly in the fireplace was responsible for waking her up calmly. Looking around, she gets confused upon seeing herself lying in the soft bed beside Ju-won and Dorothy, remembering clearly having fallen asleep on the cold floor of the shed the previous night. With flushed cheeks, the young woman notices that her husband carried her in his arms with all the affection, and that he even gave his own arm to serve as a pillow for her. Lizzie hugs little Dorothy with much tenderness, and lets out a sweet smile, feeling that she finally found the peace and true love she always dreamed of having in life. Lizzie feels deeply relieved lying there, realizing that the marriage nights she knew in the past were never as sweet and peaceful as this one. She keeps watching his face from up close, and thinks about how her whole life began to change for the better since the day she met this man. Except that, suddenly, Ju-won lets out a quiet grumble while he sleeps, which leaves Lizzie surprised and with her heart racing from embarrassment. Still half asleep, the young man simply passes his arm over them and pulls Lizzie and Dorothy even closer to his body. With her face glued to his chest, the young woman feels her cheeks burn from shyness and thinks her heart is about to explode from so much emotion. Lizzie feels a comforting little warmth through her whole body and closes her eyes with a gentle smile, wishing that moment of peace could last forever. When morning arrives and the sunlight begins to clear the room, Ju-won wakes up lazily and notices that only little Dorothy remains lying by his side. He sits up in bed carefully so as not to make noise and adjusts the blanket over the girl, who still sleeps a very heavy sleep. The young man gives a very soft caress to the little girl's blonde hair, who just grumbles quietly and continues resting peacefully. Meanwhile, Lizzie is already on her feet in the cabin kitchen, walking with a bucket in her hands to give a start to the first chores of the day. At that, Ju-won appears suddenly and firmly holds the bucket handle, startling the young woman who did not expect that he takes over the task with a friendly smile and leaves Lizzie totally awkward with his so gentlemanly gesture. The young man then takes charge of the heavy work and throws the water out with ease, sparing his wife from any physical effort. Right after, Ju-won looks at her and says an affectionate word using his own language of origin. Lizzie gets quite confused and flushed, trying to understand what those mysterious words mean. Upon perceiving her doubt, he asks in the local tongue if his dear wife managed to sleep well, making Lizzie's face turn red from embarrassment at the exact same time. She shakes her head, agreeing shyly, while her husband begins to wonder if all that shyness is because of the affectionate nickname he used. He finds amusement in her reaction and concludes she really got very embarrassed for being called dear. So as not to leave her uncomfortable, Ju-won asks how she prefers to be called and suggests using just the name Lizzie from now on. However, stammering a lot and with her face burning, the young woman takes courage and asks for him to continue calling her dear. With a playful smile, Ju-won repeats the affectionate nickname very loudly, making Lizzie hide her face totally flushed with embarrassment. Totally bashful, the young woman ends up turning her back to him, revealing even her very red nape from the embarrassment. Ju-won finds her reaction incredibly cute and feels a huge desire to continue teasing his wife a bit more. He gives a very light poke to her back with his finger and insists for his dear to look at him. At that moment, little Dorothy wakes up in a hop in bed, interrupting the couple's playful interaction while she rubs her little eyes from sleep. The little girl is still drooling and daydreaming with a giant piece of juicy meat flying in her direction. Totally focused on her hunger, the little one descends from the bed in a hurry and throws herself to the floor to go after food. She begins to run through the cabin making the biggest noise, which makes the parents look surprised at all that energy so early. However, Dorothy passes straight by them without giving the slightest attention, leaving the couple completely paralyzed, and without understanding anything, Dorothy's eyes shine intensely upon spotting the fresh meat, making her shout with joy at that wonderful sight. Seeing the little girl stuff herself headfirst inside the food barrel to grab the meat, the couple cannot avoid laughter in front of such a cute scene. Ju-won begins to laugh out loud with her obsession with food, thinking that he really needs to work hard so as not to let anything be lacking for his family. Meanwhile, Dorothy continues with her little legs to the air and swinging her feet inside the barrel, shouting without stopping for her dear meat. Motivated by the great appetite of his daughter, the young man gives a warm smile and fills himself with determination to secure an excellent hunt on this day of today. Later, he walks confident through the dense forest, thinking to himself that he would have no problem at all in facing another giant wolf like the one from the last time. To guarantee the success of his journey, Ju-won holds firmly his sharp axe, knowing that now he has a much more reliable weapon in his hands. His firm steps go crushing the damp vegetation while he embosoms himself more and more in the heart of the closed woods. Suddenly, the young man stops walking upon feeling a bizarre change in the environment and looks around trying to understand what is happening. he notices that the forest suddenly fell into an absolute silence, wrapped by a heavy and somewhat terrifying atmosphere. Despite being outdoors in the middle of such a vast woods, Juwan squeezes the handle of his axe with strength upon feeling a strange, suffocating sensation. He stands in total alert, wondering what type of monstrous beast is about to appear right in front of him. At that, the young man hears slow steps approaching and notices a mysterious silhouette coming in his direction from between the trees. Juwan gets quite surprised and confused upon realizing that, instead of a wild animal who is coming, there is a person. The unknown man continues walking calmly, wearing a dark cloak with a hood that hides a good part of his face. Upon arriving a bit closer, he reveals himself an old man with a graying beard and serious facial expression who stares at him in a very deep manner. While the two evaluate each other mutually in the middle of the woods, Juwan tries not to show nervousness while he wonders who that man could be. In fact, that mysterious old man was investigating the surroundings and ended up finding several trails of blood and claw marks on the forest rocks. He analyzed with care those gigantic footprints and suspected that the young man might have some accomplice, but ended up discovering that he lived alone. Furthermore, after spending several days watching the isolated cabin from afar, the old man noticed that the young man was so inexperienced that he did not even know how to hold an axe right. Precisely because of that, he finds it very strange and suspicious that a fellow so clumsy for hunting managed to defeat a beast of that size without help from anyone. The old man thinks to himself that it is simply impossible that even a professional hunter managed to defeat such a monstrous creature without using any decent weapon. He continues murmuring some confused words while he stares at the young man from very close with suspicion. Decided to unveil this mystery once and for all, the old man concludes he needs to do a verification on his own account to have absolute certainty of his suspicions. He then continues walking slowly until standing face to face with Juwan, who remains motionless holding his axe. The man of the hood stops right in front of the young man, maintaining a firm and enigmatic look that analyzes him from top to bottom. Suddenly, the old man's eyes are drawn by some very recent claw and bite marks that are exposed on Juwan's arm. He realizes on the spot that this mark was caused by teeth of a giant wolf, but stands shocked to see that the wound is perfectly clean and healed, when the normal thing would be for the youth to have passed away from infection, since such a deep bite should have completely lacerated his muscles and blood vessels to the point of leaving him motionless. The man realizes that there only exists one logical explanation for that. He swallows hard in front of that unbelievable realization, beginning to suspect strongly that this young woodsman is in truth a very rare mage. After all, in that mysterious new world, mages really existed and possessed fantastic abilities that went far beyond the comprehension of common people. These powerful beings were legendary and rare figures that common commoners almost never had the chance to see personally during their whole life. While Juwan continues in silence, the old man fills himself with expectation upon thinking that if the young man really is a mage, his plans change completely. A wicked smile appears on the old man's face, whose eyes begin to shine with a mysterious purple light upon realizing that his big chance finally arrived. He feels that this is the perfect opportunity to secure the vengeance he sought so much, and that he thought he would never attain before passing away. Perceiving that the mood became extremely heavy and hostile, Juwan stands very tense and wonders internally what type of person that stranger is. The old man then begins to recall his own story, thinking about how today he is just a broken old man, but that in the past he already was a strong youth filled with ambition. He recalls that the forest guards who took care of the lands of the nobles were obliged to fight in the war, but that the survivors who stood out could become very close advisors to the Lord himself. Motivated by this promise of ascent, he left his father's house and departed alone as an independent hunter, seeking to establish himself in a nearby village to work as a woodcutter. Soon, he managed to reach his goal and became the official woodcutter of that community, since the mountain of the region was incredibly rich in trees and resources. The only difficulty of that period was how to organize the collection of firewood in a peaceful manner, since even common commoners had free permission to enter the forest of the Lord of Lands. Because of that, he ended up having no other choice but to venture into the deepest parts of the mountain, thinking it would be a great opportunity to know the terrain better. At that time, the youth did not even suspect the real reason for which the residents of the village only gathered firewood right on the edge of the forest, avoiding entering the dense woods to sign the official contract of forest guard. The Lord's rules strictly demanded that the worker be with all his 4 limbs in a perfect state of health. However, shortly before officializing the agreement, he ended up suffering a terrible attack that gravely injured his leg and disqualified him forever. The young woodcutter could never imagine that such a terrible threat would be lying in wait for him in the heart of that dark mountain. he ended up discovering in the worst possible way that this isolated region was in truth the territory of a horde of terrible goblins. Injured and without managing to run, he tried to hide desperate inside a hollow tree trunk while he listened to the terrifying growls of the creatures very close to himself. These cruel monsters had the terrible habit of kidnapping the human women of the region to force them to bear their half-breed descendants. Because of these constant kidnappings, the local village ended up losing almost all its women and became completely desolated. With time, that whole area became tragically known in the surroundings as the Village of the Goblins, while the young woodcutter shouted in pain upon being captured by the creatures. Since that fateful day, he endured a miserable and lonely life, feeding daily the desire to take revenge on the monsters that ruined his destiny and on the people he hated so much. He lived isolated for decades in those lands, with a single fixed thought in his mind that one day he would pay back all those wretched ones. His only life goal was to survive at any cost until the moment in which he could burn the entire nest of the creatures until it turned to ashes. And now, looking right at Ju-hwan, the old man realizes that this mysterious outsider possesses all the necessary potential to help him realize his great desire. He notices that the young man has an extraordinary physical build and a gigantic strength that would never be seen in any common resident of that mountain. Besides all that, Ju-hwan demonstrated possessing that absurd regenerative capacity that completely healed his deep wounds in very little time. The old man concludes that he has the potential to become the strongest and most implacable monster hunter that ever existed in the entire region. At the moment, the goblins continue hidden in the depths of the forest, but the old man knows that as soon as their female prisoners run out, they certainly will attack the village after new victims being so. The old man's plan is to train the youth in secret and transform him into a formidable warrior before this new invasion happens. However, he knows he needs to keep the threat of the goblins an absolute secret until the young man signs the forest guard contract. Because the magic of the agreement will prevent Ju-hwan from giving up and fleeing from there, Ju-hwan makes a respectful bow and thanks the hooded old man using some polite words in his native language. The old hunter notices the young man's posture and remarks that even while bowing in a friendly manner, he keeps his body weight shifted back so as not to lower his guard in any way. With a sympathetic smile, the elder extends his hand and affirms that starting from that day, he is going to teach everything he knows about survival to the young man. He guarantees that the young man has everything to become an excellent hunter, leaving Ju-hwan quite confused and intrigued with that so generous and sudden offer. The next day, Ju-hwan wakes up with the strange sensation of having just closed his eyes and sees Lizzie and Dorothy very excited in the kitchen preparing breakfast. Suddenly, the young man hears sounds of steps coming from outside the cabin and turns quickly to check who is arriving. Looking through the crack, he spots the hooded old man walking in his direction and thinks to himself that he does not want to allow that stranger to enter his house. The young man gets worried about creating the habit of letting visitors enter freely there, especially from knowing that Lizzie and Dorothy usually spend a lot of time alone in the cabin. Being so, he decides to leave quickly to the yard and close the door behind himself to welcome the visitor outside. Upon coming across that wrinkled and sympathetic face again, Ju-hwan feels a chill down his spine and thinks that this man has an extremely suspicious smile. That smile of the old man makes Ju-hwan remember on the spot the fake expressions that human resources managers made in his old corporate job on Earth. In any case, knowing he needs to learn to hunt to support his family, he places his bag on his back, decided to give his best on the journey. He turns around to say goodbye to Lizzie and tries to reassure her, saying affectionately that he will be fine and that he will not take long to return. The young Camponesa gets quite awkward while she runs against time to finish preparing a special snack for her husband to take on the trip. Seeing all that dedication and shyness of his wife, Ju-hwan feels his heart warm up and thinks about how she is incredibly cute. Meanwhile, little Dorothy observes all the movement in silence with her little finger in her mouth in a quite curious look. Suddenly, the little girl makes a quick decision and begins to run in a hurried way through the cabin kitchen. She stops right in front of Ju-hwan with her little arms open and a serious expression, blocking the exit in a very cute way and leaving the young man confused. Dorothy points backward and warns her father that he cannot go away without first grabbing the snack that her mother prepared with so much affection. Lizzie then approaches shyly and places the package of food inside his bag, insisting with a trembling voice for her husband to nourish himself well during the hunt. The young man gives a genuine smile of happiness. Thinking about how wonderful it is to finally have a family that really cares about his well-being, Lizzie accompanies him to the exit and wishes a good trip with her gentle voice, which makes Ju-hwan understand on the spot her affectionate intention. He tries to repeat the phrase in the local language to learn and confirms joyfully that he will take all the care of the world in the woods. With her cheeks pink from shyness, the young woman gives a gentle smile and shakes her head, happy to hear that her husband intends to return as soon as possible. Right after, Lizzie looks down, drawing Dorothy's attention, who was just peeking at the conversation from the corner. The little girl then goes running with a giant smile on her face, shouting very loudly to wish that her father has an excellent trip. Juwan bends down to her height and waves with his hands very joyful, promising that he will return in a blink of an eye to the arms of his daughter. However, upon beginning to walk toward the forest beside the hooded old man, the young man feels a tightening in his chest and realizes he did not want to leave his home in any way. He gives one last peek over his shoulder, engraving that affectionate scene in his mind with all the love of the world. After all, his new wife and his little daughter were simply too cute and adorable, making it almost impossible for Juwan to want to stay away from them for a long time. The two continue walking forest inward, and Juwan begins to wonder how long they have already been walking without stopping. He stands quite thoughtful with that endless journey, without managing to understand what the old man wants to show him that demands so much walking. Suddenly, the hooded old man interrupts his steps and speaks something in his own language. Pointing firmly to the ground, Juwan looks down intrigued, wondering if the man wants him to pay attention specifically to the way he positions his feet. Without giving greater explanations, the elder returns to walking slowly, giving firm and intentional steps through the woods. Looking closely, the young man realizes that each step of the old man sinks in an uncommon manner and leaves extremely deep and precise marks in the dirt. Juwan stands completely shocked to notice that the footprints left behind are too bizarre for a common walk. He continues observing the trail left in the damp soil and confirms that the gait of that old hunter hides some bizarre secret. The young man remembers his readings from Earth and begins to wonder if that would not be some legendary movement, technique like the ones he saw in martial arts books. One way or another, he decides that the only way to master that mysterious ability is to focus all his attention on observing and imitating each step of his new tutor. Juwan begins to give his first steps on the trail, trying to imitate with precision the heavy and focused gait of the old man. The old hunter turns discreetly backward to check if his new pupil is managing to replicate the exercise in a correct manner. Upon seeing the young man's effort, he gives a light nod of his head and lets out an enigmatic smile, quite satisfied with the rapid evolution of the young man. From that moment on, the elder began to teach Juwan diverse valuable knowledges and practical secrets about the mountain. He made the young man touch the bark of several trees to show that each mountain possesses its own species of plants with unique characteristics. Furthermore, the old man oriented him to pass his hands through the damp soil several times, helping him to feel and map with precision the terrain of that territory. After spending a good amount of time in this intense routine of learning, the two decide to make a brief pause and Juwan sits on a rock to recover his breath. In this instant, the hooded old man brings his hand to his small leather pouch fastened to his waist to grab something. He pulls out from inside a small cylindrical wooden object that seems to be a very rustic type of whistle. Upon realizing that the master finally is going to show him a practical hunting technique, Juwan stands quite enthusiastic and focuses all his attention on the elder. Excited to have a meal, Juwan thinks affectionately that finally he will be able to savor the delicious snack that Lizzie prepared with so much love. He opens the wooden box with a good amount of expectation and a satisfied smile stamped on his face. Upon feeling the wonderful aroma of the fresh food, the young man celebrates joyfully, but the hooded old man warns him immediately not to open the lunchbox there in any way. Juwan gets completely confused and takes a startle when the master points in a serious way to the woods around. The old man gestures indicating the forest and shakes his head in a negative way, showing that having meals in the middle of nowhere is a very grave mistake of survival. He explains that the strong smell of cooked and seasoned food spreads with much ease through the air and attracts wild predators in a blink of an eye. Very disappointed, Juwan closes his lunchbox back, lamenting that all the effort Lizzie made early on to cook went in vain at that moment. He stands with such a desolated facial expression and with such a desire to cry that the hooded old man himself observes him from the corner without understanding right that dramatic reaction. Later, the two walk to a rustic wooden cabin in the middle of the forest, and Juwan realizes that this simple place is the home of his new master. The old man enters the residence and leaves right after holding two very long hunting bows, drawing the young man's attention by the somewhat uncommon shape of those weapons. Juwan grows thoughtful upon noticing that the bow delivered to him is almost totally straight, since the only weapons of this type that he knew had very curved shapes. The young man wonders in silence how someone would manage to shoot with precision using an instrument with that so simple appearance of a staff. Without stalling, the old man delivers one of the bows to Juwan and gestures in a rough way for him to accompany him in silence. While he follows the master through the clearing, the young man continues questioning himself internally if that rudimentary weapon really works. He realizes it must be necessary to have a simply monstrous physical strength to manage to bend and pull the string of a giant bow of those. But, contradicting his expectations, the old hunter tensions the bow with extreme ease. Raising his aim in the direction of the target, Juwan remarks impressed that even holding such a heavy tension on the string, the old man's body remains perfectly static, as if the time around were frozen. In a quick instant, the hunter releases the string and launches the arrow with a booming sound directly against a tree at a distance. The shot is so potent that the arrow punctures deeply the firm trunk of the tree, scattering wood splinters to all sides with the impact. Upon seeing the smoke rising from the bark of the tree hit with so much brutality, Juwan stands totally marveled to witness the true shooting ability of his master. Juwan positions himself and tries to pull the string of that heavy bow, concentrating all his physical strength to bend the firm wood. The old master approaches slowly and begins to manually correct the position of the young man's arms and posture. Trembling a bit with the extreme effort, Juwan begins to sweat from tiredness and wonders how the old man managed to stay so static under that gigantic tension. He takes a deep breath, ignores the muscular pains, and focuses all his determination on aiming perfectly at the target in front of him. At that moment, the young man reflects on each new word he learned and the precise movements he needs to master to become a true hunter. Juwan knows very well that he will have to study and train plenty to manage to perform all those chores alone in a near future. With his look shining with determination, the young man reinforces in his mind the sincere desire to be a strong man, capable of supporting and protecting his beloved wife and his little daughter. Meanwhile, in the security of their cabin, little Dorothy hums cheerfully about the blue sky, the cold snow, and the glow of Lizzie's hair. She amuses herself in bed, swinging her little arms and legs filled with energy, singing also about Juwan's black hair and about the delicious meat they ate with her little belly well filled. The little girl sits with a massive smile of satisfaction, feeling that the tasty meat she supped is leaving her more and more strong and healthy. Suddenly, Dorothy hears Lizzie let out a gentle risadinha in the corner of the room and stands observing her adoptive mother with much attention. The little girl notices that her mother started to smile with much more frequency since Juwan arrived in their life, something that almost never happened in the difficult past they lived. Every time she hears this sincere laugh, Dorothy feels a comforting little warmth in her chest, as if she were seated right next to a warm fireplace in the winter. She rubs her own chubby belly, laughing for no reason, wishing that digestion is quick so she can eat even more of that delicious meat. However, a silent doubt begins to arise in her childish mind about what Juwan in fact represents to her, since he is the husband of her adoptive mother. Knowing that Juwan and Lizzie are not her biological parents, the little one feels a sudden fear that they might abandon her from one hour to the next, just like her old father did. She wonders, worried if, by being husband and wife, Juwan in the future would decide to take care of just Lizzie and leave her behind. With her little eyes filled with tears, the little girl begins to question herself with much sadness. What would become of her if she stayed alone in the world again? But her sad thoughts are interrupted suddenly when she realizes a strange change in the room. She looks to the sides, confused and scared upon realizing that Lizzie just vanished from the room, leaving the bed completely empty in that silence. The painful memory of a male voice shouting that she was a useless girl echoes in Dorothy's mind suddenly. She recalls with terror when that terrible man said she was just a nuisance, who wasted food, and who was no use for anything for not being a boy. All that rejection from the past makes the little girl shiver with fear, bringing back the panic of being considered a dead weight by the new family, to prove her value and not be discarded. Dorothy runs desperate in the direction of the food barrel to guarantee that the valuable meat is well stored. Upon seeing that the stock continues secure inside there, she lets out a relieved sigh, but soon goes back to worrying about the sudden vanishing of Lizzie. It is at this moment that she hears a thick and quite aggressive voice shouting from outside the house, demanding to know what they are hiding. The little girl takes a massive startle with that sudden shout and stands completely paralyzed with terror in the middle of the kitchen. Trying not to make the slightest noise, Dorothy slowly approaches a high window and peeks with much care into the yard. Looking out, she spots 3 residents of the village carrying axes and scythes, and recognizes those men at the exact same hour. Dorothy remembers that those same guys used to go to her old house to beat her late father, who then took out all the anger mistreating her and her stepmother in a terrible way. Dorothy stands extremely scared behind the door, trembling with fear upon thinking if Lizzie will be fine, or if she will end up suffering the same sad destiny of her late biological mother outside. The leader of the invaders holds Lizzie with strength by the shoulder and accuses her of having stolen the precious meat of the village. The young woman tries to defend herself, saying desperate that her husband hunted the animal on the mountain, but the blonde man just laughs with mockery and scoffs at her justification. At that, the sidekick of red hair shouts at her in a cruel way, affirming they were generous to arrange a new partner for her to survive, and that now she was paying back stealing their lands. Ignoring the tears and pleas of Lizzie, the abuser decides to invade the house to verify what else she would have supposedly stolen. Without any hesitation, the coward tells the Campanesa to shut her mouth and throws her with extreme violence against the damp ground of the yard. The 3 criminals enter by force into the dark cabin and begin to look around in search of any item of value. The leader approaches a support in the corner and stands mouth agape upon touching the huge and soft giant wolf hide that Ju-wan had hung there. His eyes shine with pure greed upon realizing that this extraordinary hide is worth a true fortune and that they just found a great treasure. With a wicked smile on his face, he orders his partners to rummage through each corner of the residence to carry away absolutely everything they can. Dorothy huddles under the table, trembling with terror, listening to one of the men remark that he smelled meat coming from inside there too. With her heart racing from fear, she hears the leader of the gang curse and say he refuses to believe that Ju-wan really hunted that beast. It is in this instant that Lizzie runs desperate back into the cabin to try to contain the action of the bandits. She positions herself right in front of the protective wolf hide with her arms open, shouting with all her forces for them not to touch that, crying from terror, but with much determination. The Campanesa insists that this precious hide now belongs by right to her family. However, the blonde invader approaches her with disdain, scoffing at the fact that she never had courage to raise her voice to anyone in the village. Irritated with her audacity to face him, the coward abuser delivers a violent slap against Lizzie, shouting with hatred that she is only brave for having arranged a husband. With the brutal impact of the assault, the young woman is thrown far away and falls helpless against the wooden floor of the cabin. She lets out a groan of deep pain, feeling all the weight of the physical assaults that so much terrified her in the past return with full force. Hidden under the table, little Dorothy watches all that violent scene in absolute shock, while Lizzie stares at her with her eyes wide from concern. Fallen on the floor, Lizzie cries quietly while she hides her injured face, feeling completely powerless in front of so much wickedness. However, she suddenly widens her eyes upon realizing something and turns her face in the direction of the hiding place under the table. Dorothy continues huddled and in panic, remembering with guilt how she always pretended she did not see the violences in her old house to protect herself. The little girl begins to cry in silence under the table, thinking she is a bad girl for just hiding and wondering what she can do to save her new mother. Outside the hiding place, the criminals continue scoffing at the suffered facial expression of Lizzie, although one of them demonstrates fear in case the guardian of the mountain discovers the invasion. The leader of the gang dismisses the companion's fear with contempt, saying that Ju-wan does not understand the local language and that no one is going to discover anything if they keep their mouths closed. Decided to conclude the crime, the abuser grabs Lizzie by the arm with violence and pulls her upward without any pity. He warns the companions that he is going to drag the woman while they rob the rest of the things, making the Campanesa groan in pain upon trying to resist. The blonde man makes a terrible threat, warning that if she tells anything to her husband, they will return in the middle of the night to burn the entire cabin with everyone inside. Under cruel guffaws, the group finally moves away from the cabin carrying the precious wolf hide and dragging the young Campanesa as a hostage. Dorothy gets up slowly from the floor of the room, in panic upon realizing that Lizzie was taken by force by those cruel men. Desperate and crying hard, the little girl begins to run through the empty house, dying of fear that her mother will never return. She stops near the exit and smothers a sob of despair with her hands, not knowing what to do in the midst of that terrible situation. The little one falls into weeping without managing to contain the pain, crying copiously in front of the terrible fear of loneliness and abandonment. Climbing onto a box in the yard, she shouts Ju-wan's name with all her forces, begging in tears for her father to return quick to save them. While the tears stream down her face, she sees from afar the invaders moving away through the forest and carrying Lizzie away as a prisoner. Meanwhile, in the middle of the dense forest, Juhuan walks back home by the side of the master hunter, sighing from tiredness after a long day of training. Suddenly, the hooded old man draws the young man's attention by giving a light touch to his shoulder to signal the end of today's journey. Juhuan makes a respectful bow and thanks from the bottom of his heart for all the valuable teachings he received. However, before he could give one more step, the young man hears a desperate shout echoing from afar and recognizes immediately Dorothy's voice. He widens his eyes in total alert, knowing very well that the little girl would never cry in that desperate way if everything were fine at home. Panic takes over the young man, who begins to run in a hurried way in the direction of the cabin, fearing that something terrible has happened to his family. While he dashes through the woods at high speed, he thinks desperate that he is not going to forgive anyone if any harm has happened to Lizzie or Dorothy. Upon coming out into a clearing, Juhuan finally spots the 3 men of the village carrying his belongings and dragging his wife by force. An uncontrollable fury takes over his entire being, making his eyes shine with hatred while he roars with violence that he is going to end the life of whoever touched his family. One of the companions hears the enraged shout and turns backward, confused, without having time to react to the threat that approaches. Without any pity, Juhuan appears like a lightning bolt and delivers a devastating punch directly to the face of the red-haired abuser. The blow is so brutal that the man is thrown with violence against the dirt ground, fainting immediately under the terrified looks of the other 2 companions. Upon seeing her husband appear in such an imposing manner to defend her, Lizzie sheds tears of relief and calls his name with a trembling voice. With a frightening posture and exhaling pure hatred, Juhuan advances with firm steps in the direction of the 2 remaining criminals, who back away trembling with terror in front of his giant's fury. The second sidekick stands completely terrified to see his companion be defeated with just 1 punch, trembling with fear in front of Juhuan. Without giving reaction time, the Prota delivers an avassalador kick that hits the fellow's face right on. The man falls knocked out at the exact same hour, letting out a smothered groan while his body collides against the soil. Desperate, the blonde leader of the gang tries to counterattack and advances with his fist raised in Juhuan's direction to strike him. However, Juhuan dodges easily from the attack and grabs the man with a quick and extremely potent movement. Lifting the adversary without any difficulty, the Prota throws him with brutal strength against the ground. The leader of the gang collides violently on his back on the soil, losing completely his breath with the devastating impact of the fall. Juhuan positions himself mounted over the abuser and raises his clenched fist, decided to give a definitive lesson so that he never returns. He delivers a violent punch against the face of the coward, aware that cruel people never stop tormenting others unless they feel a real terror. Wrapped by a blue aura of pure fury, the young man fixes a cold look on the abuser, determined to engrave that fear in their minds so that they never dare return to the cabin. However, the fallen blonde tries to use his last forces to grab his hunting scythe fallen on the ground for a treacherous attack. Upon perceiving the dishonest movement of the enemy, Lizzie shouts desperate by her husband's name to alert him about the imminent danger. The man gets up in a hop and delivers a scythe blow against Juhuan's head in a treacherous manner. With absurd reflexes, the young man turns quickly and holds firmly the arm of the attacker before the blade hits him. Juhuan squeezes the abuser's wrist with so much brutality that the bone begins to crack, making the coward shout in agony. With his eyes glowing intensely in blue and teeth gritted from pure hatred, the Prota seems ready to reap the opponent's life. It is in this moment of extreme tension that the Master Hunter appears from the shadows, shouting in an imposing way for Juhuan to stop with that immediately. The old man holds his disciple's arm with firmness and insists for him to calm down before he commits an irreparable tragedy. He points in the direction of the cabin and warns Juhuan in a severe manner, asking if he cannot perceive how terrified little Dorothy is to watch all that violence. Lizzie observes the situation from afar with a squeezed heart, immensely worried with the uncontrolled fury that took over her husband. Dorothy cries desperate behind the wooden opening upon watching all that confusion. Juhuan calms down little by little and turns backward upon perceiving the state of panic of little Dorothy. Silence finally returns around the small cabin in the middle of the forest. Lizzie stands surprised to realize that her husband, who always seemed so gentle and incapable of getting irritated, can become someone frighteningly furious. For a brief instant, the way he faced the invaders made the young woman remember her late husband. She gets to feel a brief moment of panic upon looking at the fallen men, wondering if she would also be attacked in that brutal way. However, all the fear disappears in the instant in which she looks into Juhuan's eyes and realizes he does not want to scare her. Lizzie notices that those eyes only revealed a desperate desire to protect her. Now the young man's look reveals pure concern for thinking she is afraid of him upon calling her by name. Ju-won demonstrates so much concern that Lizzie wonders why the reaction of a woman without value like her would matter so much to him. The young woman stands moved in front of that affectionate and protective look. Her own hands tremble without stopping from pure nervousness. What makes her husband think she is still terrified because of him? Lizzie only wanted to ask for her husband, not to make that so sad and hurt expression. It would be easy to say with all letters that she is not afraid, but the language barrier prevents them from understanding each other by words. To bypass this difficulty, she extends her trembling hand in his direction. Calling by Ju-won's name, she tries to convey her feelings through a simple gesture. The two give a step forward to shorten the distance. Ju-won holds her hands with extreme delicacy to comfort her. In the instant in which she feels the warmth of his hand, Lizzie has an absolute certainty. She smiles relieved upon realizing that, by the side of that generous man, she will be always protected and no one else will be able to do her harm. Lizzie supports affectionately the injured hands of her husband against her own face. Crying from pure happiness, the young woman thanks from the bottom of her heart for him having appeared to save her. Ju-won stands a bit awkward and surprised in front of so much demonstration of affection. Lizzie continues holding his hand together with her cheek while she tries to pronounce his name, with affection. Without hesitating more, the young man pulls her to a tight and protective hug while she repeats mentally her thanks. Ju-won reciprocates the hug, giving light pats on her back, wondering why she feels so grateful. He thinks that, in truth, it is he who should be immensely grateful for having her in his life. Suddenly, Lizzie remembers something very important and widens her eyes from surprise. Meanwhile, in the cabin, Dorothy continues observing everything from afar with a very sad face and huddled from fear. Lizzie points quickly in the direction of the cabin and calls by her husband to alert him about the little girl. Without wasting time, the young woman begins to run back home while she calls by little Dorothy. Upon entering, running in the room, she asks worried if the girl is fine, but comes across the little one trembling a lot. Lizzie stands scared to perceive the distant reaction of her adoptive daughter Dorothy, continues huddled on top of the box, trembling with terror in front of everything she just saw. The little girl cannot forget the image of Ju-won delivering those violent blows, thinking all that strength too scary in her mind. Begin to arise painful memories of the injured and hematoma-filled faces of her stepmother and of Lizzie herself. The panic of going through the same violence makes Dorothy try to hold her crying at any cost, because she learned in the past that crying only brought more punishments. She feels she needs to ask for forgiveness immediately before Lizzie goes to ignore her completely, just like her stepmother did, stretching out her little arms. The girl asks for pardon for having hidden instead of helping and begs not to be left alone. Dorothy cries desperately, repeating that all the guilt for that having happened was only hers. Lizzie hugs the girl with strength and asks with tenderness what she is talking about. She explains with affection that she pretended not to know her before, just to avoid that the cruel men discovered her hiding place. The young woman comforts her daughter, saying she has no guilt of absolutely nothing, making little Dorothy look surprised at her. Lizzie tries to reassure her, saying that the danger already passed because her daddy now is here, but the little girl stands confused since her true father passed away. At that, the young woman asks if the girl really does not know who Ju-won is to her. Dorothy answers with innocence that she knows only that Ju-won is Lizzie's husband. What rips a loving smile from the adoptive mother, Lizzie confirms and explains, with all the patience of the world, that, as Ju-won is her husband, that makes him the new father of Dorothy. To help the girl understand, she remembers she is Dorothy's stepmother, and the little girl agrees immediately. Lizzie then concludes that, being Dorothy her daughter, Ju-won becomes automatically her father. Leaving the little one completely shocked with the revelation, Dorothy looks through the window, in direction of the giant of back in the yard, trying to process the idea that this strong man now is her new father. Dorothy asks confused if that man really is her father, and Lizzie confirms, smiling with a nod of head. The young woman makes a caress on the head of the little one and explains that Ju-won is totally different from her late father because he would never harm them and only beat those men to defend them. The little girl begins to comprehend that the reason Ju-won fought in such a brutal way against the invaders was precisely to protect her like a true father. Taken by a wave of hope, Dorothy gets up in a hop and runs filled with enthusiasm in direction of the cabin door. She opens the wood panel and shouts for her father with all the strength of her lungs. Looking at the giant in the yard, she perceives that this man of strong arms and immense body is her true protector. Dorothy goes running to the yard, overflowing with happiness to perceive that now she has an incredible and super strong father who will always take care of her and of Lizzie. While she runs, she remembers with affection how he hugs her with care at night when they sleep together, proving he is someone incapable of doing her harm. The little girl recalls his gentle smiles, how he always gives her tasty pieces of meat, and that it was he who chose her beautiful name. With a massive smile on her face, Dorothy feels like the luckiest girl in the world to perceive how wonderful it is to have someone so special as her new father. Ju-won gets startled to hear the little girl shout an unknown word and turns quickly backward. He sees the reflection of Dorothy running joyfully in his direction, with a smile from ear to ear. Without thinking twice, the young man opens his arms with affection to receive the little girl. Dorothy hops with everything into his lap, and Ju-won welcomes her in a warm and comforting hug. Even without understanding the tongue that the girl speaks, he feels in his heart the true meaning of those words of affection. The young man stands up holding the little one in his arms, happy to finally see that she lost her fear of him. Suddenly, Ju-won feels a strange smell coming from Dorothy's clothes and begins to sniff, confused. Looking closer, he perceives with humor that the little girl ended up making pee in her clothes from so much fear she felt. Before seeing that so happy and innocent face, he decides he needs to change her clothes very quick so that she does not end up catching a cold. Meanwhile, Lizzie comes running, hurried from the interior of the house to join her husband and little Dorothy. Lizzie joins them and hugs her husband with affection, celebrating that moment of peace and union in family. Suddenly, Dorothy remembers something very important and looks backward, scared upon realizing the whereabouts of the meat. Without thinking twice, the little girl descends from Ju-won's lap and runs hurried shouting for her beloved food. Ju-won calls for the little one while he sees her pass, running straight by the bodies of the invaders stretched out on the ground. Dorothy ignores totally the fallen men and focuses only on the bucket filled with fresh meat that was with them. She stops in front of the wood container and observes the beautiful pieces of meat with her eyes shining from pure greed. Demonstrating her typical obsession with food, the little girl makes strength to try to raise that heavy wood bucket. With a surprising effort, she manages to lift the immense bucket above her head with her own hands. From afar, Lizzie and Ju-won run desperate upon seeing the girl carry so much weight alone. Dorothy makes a grumpy and pure effort expression. Determined not to let her precious meal fall in any way, Ju-won stands completely shocked to see the unbelievable strength that this little girl demonstrates to carry so much weight. He thinks that the obsession the girl has for meat is something really scary, while Lizzie cannot contain her laughter to see the scene. The young man approaches Dorothy and takes the heavy bucket from her hands in a very smooth manner. Dorothy raises her little arms, super joyful to see Ju-won lift the meat bucket without any effort. The prota perceives that the little one's look shines so much because of a mere piece of food that he gets to find funny how easy it is to be a child's hero. Lizzie claps hands and gestures for them to take the meat inside the cabin before it spoils. She points to the door and asks for them to also put Dorothy inside, because it is still dangerous to stay there in the yard. The little girl runs excited to the house entrance, repeating joyfully that they finally have meat to eat. Ju-won lets out a sigh of relief for seeing that his family is safe and sound in the comfort of home. He then walks back to the yard, where the three invaders continue fallen and groaning in pain on the dirt ground. With a dark face and his eyes shining with fury, the young man seems ready to finish once and for all with the abusers. However, the old hunter appears quickly and places his hand on his shoulder to contain him. The master warns with severity that he must not beat or kill those people, making Ju-won question if he really should spare their lives. The young man reflects that his master is right and that it would be terrible to end up imprisoned or enslaved again because of worms like those. Looking at Lizzie, who observes him worried from the window, he remembers that now he has a family to care for and is no longer alone. Fixing his look on the men on the ground, Ju-won warns mentally that he will store well the face of each one of them and that their destiny will be worse than passing away if they return to bother his family. The mentor agrees with his decision and points to the belongings that the invaders left fallen in the yard. He suggests gathering those useful tools, because they are essential items for whoever needs to survive in an isolated manner in the mountains. Ju-won walks back to the entrance and observes affectionately his wife welcoming Dorothy on her lap inside the house. With a quiet smile on his face, the prota enters bringing the valuable wolf hide and the box with the new provisions already inside the cabin. Ju-won opens the box he brought and begins to examine the useful tools he took from the invaders. He observes a rustic hammer and thinks to himself that losing his new family a single time would be already too painful. A sweet smile appears on his face upon perceiving the peace that finally reigns in his home. Looking at Lizzie and Dorothy seated on the wooden floor, the young man swears he will do everything to keep the two always in security. Juwon caresses with affection Lizzie's cheek, lamenting not knowing how to use magic to instantly heal that hematoma left by the violence of the invaders. The young woman smiles with tenderness and holds her husband's hands, trying to reassure him by saying she is perfectly fine. In front of that sincere demonstration of affection, the couple lets escape a shy risadinya filled with complicity. Suddenly, the young man takes his wife on his lap with all the ease of the world, leaving her totally awkward. Juwon explains he did this because the floor is cold too much, making Lizzie blush with shyness while she is carried. However, in the middle of the hug, he perceives something strange on her skin and gets confused. Lizzie looks surprised at her own face and perceives that the purple mark she had on her cheek vanished completely. The young man stands thoughtful to realize the miracle, wondering if all that exhaustive training with magic finally gave some result. Juwon opens a radiant smile of pure happiness upon realizing that finally he is capable of conjuring healing magic. For her turn, Lizzie only observes him with a confused expression, without understanding the reason for so much celebration of her husband. Meanwhile, very far from there in the village, an enraged woman shouts revolted about the stupidity of someone close. She kicks a chicken that crosses her path and grumbles that this meddling idiot does not even respect people and wants to get into everything. The elder of the village crosses his arms and asks if donating a simple piece of fabric to the guardian of the mountain really is reason for so much scandal. The wife complains furious that she stored that precious fabric for 10 years, but the elder insists they depend totally on the goodwill of the guardian. He argues that the man looks like an experienced warrior and that if more peasants end up injured, this year's harvest will be ruined. The leader calls the woman a fool for not seeing the complete situation, affirming he had a very clear vision on the previous day about what they should do. The leader of the village recalls that when Juhwan arrived, he had recent wounds from bites of beasts that were healing in an astonishingly quick way. He concludes that what old Gus said is the absolute truth, and that the young man, in fact, is a mage with incredible healing powers. The old man perceives he needs to handle that discovery in a very cautious manner, because even the nobles would covet such a powerful mage. He imagines that if royalty itself interests itself in the young man, he will be able to sell him for a true fortune. With a wicked smile on his face, the man thinks that if everything goes right, he will be able to enjoy a life of luxury, much beyond being just the chief of a poor village. He walks confident between the villagers, knowing that no one else suspects anything, since all residents from there are simple and ignorant people. The elder fears that the news will spread, and some guild or influential noble ends up capturing Juhwan before he manages to profit from the young man. He decides that the old hunter Gus is the only reliable ally to watch the young man, while he searches secretly for a rich buyer. The man orders his wife to try to get close to Lizzie, commenting that Juhwan learned to hunt very quick and showed himself extremely astute. He alerts that the youth is very intelligent, and that if they do not take care, he will be able to discover that they go around embezzling the local lord's goods. The elder adds that the young man is very attached to his wife, and that if she makes friendship with Lizzie, they will be able to secure valuable hides for a much smaller price. The woman agrees and decides that in fact, there are matters that only women can resolve together. Next, the leader concludes it will also be necessary to return some of the things they confiscated from Juwan's cabin so as not to raise suspicions. While he gathers some dry branches on the floor, he grumbles that the young hunter is very dangerous and that any mistake now will bring grave problems in the future. The man throws the twigs into a lit bonfire to give start to his plan of manipulation. He laments having to open hand from some goods, but accepts that this is extremely necessary to calm the hunter's spirits in front of the high flames. The elder lets out a sinister smile upon thinking that sometimes it is necessary to sacrifice a bit to secure a much larger prize. A few days later, the peaceful and joyful mood finally returns around Juhwan's cabin in the mountains, wearing his new clean clothes. The prota listens to his wife hum cheerfully and stands happy to see her so content again. Lizzie examines the diverse provisions and gifts received and deduces that the leader of the village must have sent all that for thinking that just a roll of fabric was too little. Juhwan finds amusement to see that his wife gets incredibly happy just for recovering her old belongings and simple kitchen ingredients. Looking at all that spontaneous joy of Lizzie makes the young man remember that true happiness always lives in the simplest things of life. He walks in direction of her with an affectionate look, thinking about how much he loves her precisely for her being such a sweet and special woman. The hunter warns joyfully that he is leaving to hunt, leaving Lizzie a bit surprised with the news of last hour. The two exchange words of goodbye in a very affectionate and relaxed way in the middle of the room. Lizzie waves from the door of the house and wishes that he takes plenty of care during the journey in the forest. While he walks through the yard,
Ju-won recalls that the old hunter Gus mentioned that the two would go hunt rabbits on the day of today. He enters briefly into the wood deposit and hopes they manage to make a good hunt today. The young man thinks especially about how much little Dorothy would stand radiant, since she lives begging for any type of meat to eat. However, holding his hunting axe,
the youth feels a chill in his belly upon asking himself if he really will have courage to slaughter a defenseless little animal. He shakes his head to push away the hesitation, knowing he needs to forget his modern customs if he wants to survive as a true hunter in that hostile world. Despite this, his mind cannot stop imagining a white, cute, and chubby little rabbit running through the grass. He gets totally red from frustration upon realizing that the image of the rabbit makes him remember immediately his adorable wife Ju-hwan's sighs, hoping that if they find some rabbit, the beast is at least ugly enough to facilitate his work. However, in the deep of the dense woods, a dark creature of glowing red eyes lurks silently from behind the bushes. Ju-hwan leaves to the yard after finishing tidying his things and lets out a long sigh of tiredness. He notes that even after carrying water and cutting all the firewood of the day, there still remained a good free time before departing. The young man decides to enjoy the moment of break to train a bit of magic in the middle of the clearing. He extends his hands and reflects that, although he manages to heal light injuries with extreme ease, he still is incapable of producing a single spark of fire. This leaves him intrigued, making him wonder why his firepower worked in such an avassalador way. When he faced the giant wolf in the past, Ju-won asks himself if his firepower only manifests in situations of extreme emergency. He closes his eyes and tries to concentrate to make the energy circulate through the center of his body. The young man extends the palm of his hand to the front and shouts, excited, the name of a firestorm technique. Upon seeing that nothing happens, he shrugs, admitting he already did not expect much thing. Although he wanted a lot to master this element to cheer up Dorothy, Ju-won reflects with good humor that since the healing magic does not shine and nor makes cool noises, the little girl does not think the technique interesting in the slightest. He lets out a discouraged sigh for not managing to produce even a small flame to show to his daughter. Suddenly, the youth takes a massive startle upon feeling a different warmth and seeing sparks arise on the tip of his fingers. He observes impressed a small flame ignite on his finger, comparing it to the light of a simple lighter. At that moment, little Dorothy leaves yawning from the cabin and scratching her little eyes from sleep. The girl opens her eyes slowly, still trying to awaken herself totally. Dorothy widens her eyes from absolute surprise upon focusing her vision on the tip of the shining finger of her adoptive father. Pointing with enthusiasm, the little girl shouts, surprised to see that Ju-won's hand is producing real fire. The young man pulls his hand with care so she does not burn herself and warns for her not to come very close. But Dorothy already runs excited to tell the novelty to her mother. Dorothy stands with her eyes shining from pure admiration in front of that small, luminous miracle. Lizzie listens to the agitation and runs, hurried to the yard to see what is happening with her daughter. The young woman stands mouth dropped and calls her husband upon seeing the small magical flame shining in his hand. Dorothy hops with joy, shouting that her father knows how to use fire magic, while Ju-won tries in vain to increase the size of the flame to impress them even more. The young man celebrates mentally for now mastering the two elements, but the scene is interrupted when Lizzie lets out a cry of surprise. Ju-won stands without understanding anything when his wife gives a U-turn in a hurry and leaves running back to the interior of the cabin. Dorothy goes right behind her adoptive mother. While Lizzie runs desperate inside the house after remembering something urgent, Ju-won stands planted alone in the yard, totally confused for the two having run inside without more nor less. Looking at the fire shining on his finger, the young man begins to worry upon realizing he has not the slightest idea of how to extinguish that small flame. Without knowing what to do, he decides to simply leave the fire lit until the energy exhausts itself on its own account. However, it sufficed for him to think of this for the flame to extinguish in a blink of an eye, leaving him even more perplexed. Ju-won walks back to the cabin, grumbling that the rules of magic in that world are too bizarre and impossible to decode. Upon crossing the door of the house, the young man spots little Dorothy on her feet by the side of the great wooden bucket. Curious. Ju-won calls the little girl upon noticing she is leaned over the container with a very attentive look. Dorothy makes a Tristan-ho pout upon perceiving that the pieces of meat inside there are minuscule if compared to what she expected to eat. The hunter finds amusement to notice that his adoptive daughter is deeply discouraged simply because the food portions decreased in size. Seeing the girl's sadness, he makes a determined expression and decides that today he will bring rabbit meat in any way to satisfy her appetite. Suddenly, the imposing voice of the old hunter echoes from outside, asking if Juwan already is ready to depart. The young man leaves the house and spots the experienced hunter waiting patiently at the forest entrance. Juwan adjusts his hunting equipment and warns everyone in the house that he is already leaving. Lizzie and Dorothy accompany the young man to the door, and the little girl wishes joyfully that her father makes an excellent and secure trip. The prota makes a tender caress on the head of Dorothy and praises her for being such a good and obedient girl. Lizzie asks for him to take care, and Juwan answers with affection, wishing that she protects herself well in his absence. The couple says goodbye with a passionate kiss, leaving little Dorothy mouth open, watching the scene filled with curiosity, wanting the same affection. The little girl closes her eyes and makes a funny little pout, begging for a kiss, too. Juwan bends down smiling and warns that it is clear that Dorothy also will win a special kiss of goodbye. He gives a loud kiss on the girl's cheek, who opens a radiant smile of pure happiness before seeing her father depart to the forest. Juwan jokes with Dorothy, saying he smelled meat on her breath, and the little girl confesses with pride that she grabbed one more piece hidden after leaving the cabin. The young man and his master depart forest inward, in direction of the place where the snare traps were assembled. In the middle of the path, the old hunter continues teaching valuable lessons, pointing to the trees to test the young man's knowledges about quality firewood. In some moments, he also makes the youth stop to examine trails and rabbit feces on the floor to learn to track them. Suddenly, the mentor asks in a quiet voice for Juwan to stop walking immediately. The old man points to a specific point in the middle of the bushes, signaling they found something. Juwan widens his eyes upon focusing his vision in the direction indicated by the master caught in one of the traps. The youth spots a giant and muscular rabbit. Perceiving that this bizarre creature does not look in anything like the common rabbits he knew on Earth, he swallows hard and thinks that from being in another world, that creature looks like a scary mix of rabbit with kangaroo. The little monster shows its sharp teeth and roars furiously upon perceiving the presence of the hunters approaching. The old hunter analyzes the agitated animal and comments that since it still has plenty of energy, it must have been caught a little while ago, being the perfect prey for the disciples' first hunt. The master warns that the task will not be so simple, because data abating a creature that tries to attack you at any cost is a unique experience. He explains that hunting a furious monster is completely different from killing a defenseless animal, and that the memory of his own first hunt still continues stored in his mind until today. The elder then orders Juwan to take the bow and remove the special arrow he delivered to him. Previously, Juwan prepares his equipment, while the mentor praises him for being extremely intelligent and already managing to comprehend and speak their language in so little time. With a serious look, the old man declares formally that this first hunt belongs entirely to the young disciple. The old hunter warns he is going to teach him in practice how cruel a hunter's life can be, and guarantees he will never forget this day. He tells Juwan to give some steps forward to shorten the distance from the prey. The youth stands surprised when the master orders him to aim first at the animal's paw, explaining that this will serve as training to hit a live target in motion. Juwan listens attentive to the explanation that after the first shot, he will need to learn to hit the animal while it flails desperately from pain. The old hunter warns seriously that the mountain is fair and does not favor humans, and that unnecessary cruelty always attracts the fury of the beasts. He insists for the disciple never to forget these words if he wants to return alive home, making Juwan prepare his arrow. Juwan aims at the target, but hesitates in the depths of his heart upon thinking that shooting the rabbit's paw is not going to kill it, but rather cause an unhelpful pain. The youth begins to sweat from nervousness, still incapable of comprehending the true reason of that so severe training of his master. The mentor points firmly in the direction of the monster and orders him to shoot first at the paw and, right after, directly at the head. The rabbit monster roars enraged at a distance, salivating with sharp teeth and ready to attack if it manages to free itself. In front of that aggressive beast, Juwan is invaded by dark memories of the day he woke up for the first time in this new world. He recalls with bitterness how his own body was weak and skeletal when he found himself trapped in a dark saddle. The images of prisoners passing away little by little and sharing a miserable and inhuman space return with full force to his mind. While the beast roars with violence in the trap, the young man accepts. He still understands nothing about hunting or surviving in the forest, but has certainty of one very important thing. Juwan realizes that the old hunter is only trying to harden his heart so that he manages to live and protect his family like a true hunter. With his heart resolved, the prota finally releases the bowstring and fires his first arrow. The projectile cuts the air at high speed in direction of the monstrous rabbit. The arrow hits right on the hind paw of the beast, which lets out a sharp cry of agony while the blood squirts on the grass. Juwon lowers the bow and murmurs, startled upon realizing he really managed to hit the difficult target. Without giving time for celebrations, the mentor orders coldly for him to repeat the shot, leaving the young man perplexed with such a demand. The old man tells him to aim now at the front paws of the injured creature, and Juwon prepares another shot, aware that his master must have a good reason for this. Decided not to let himself weaken from pity, the young hunter mentalizes the faces of Lizzie and Dorothy to recover focus and the determination to fight for their survival. One more time, the monstrous rabbit squeaks from extreme pain while its blood is girato through the vegetation. Juwon pulls another arrow and tries to ignore completely the cries of agony of the beast, repeating to himself that this is nothing more than a natural noise of a wild animal in the forest. The prota swears to himself he will do whatever it takes to protect and support his beloved family. The arrow hits the creature with extreme precision under the terrified look of the monster itself. He accepts he does not care about transforming himself into a demon or into a cold assassin. As long as he manages to keep the two secure, Juwon feels a bit guilty for having caused intentional pain to the animal, knowing he could have ended its life in a much quicker manner. He comprehends that inflicting suffering goes against the natural order, but accepts the harsh reality that hunting has nothing romantic. For the young man, the hunt is a pure matter of mutual survival, but he swears he will never forget the cruelty of what he performed today. The master delivers a heavy sack to Juwon and asks for him to carry all the praise they already hunted back home. The old man smiles satisfied and thanks for the disciples' dedication along all the day and followed. The mentor signals it is time to go after the last rabbit that remained in the woods. Juwon observes the interior of his bag with much attention before making a decision. He sees a small brown rabbit of cute and gentle appearance still breathing, startled inside the sack. The young man points to the little animal and comments that it looks very different from the wild and aggressive monsters they captured before. Holding firmly the cloth sack, Juwon asks for the old hunter to wait an instant. He suggests that instead of killing the cute rabbit, they could simply raise it in captivity to generate offspring and serve as a food reserve for future emergencies. With his vocabulary still limited, the youth tries to gesture clumsily to explain to the master that he does not want to kill that gentle little creature in any way. The old hunter cannot contain himself in front of that so naive attitude and lets out an amused risadinha. With a sympathetic smile, the old man agrees with the idea and gives permission for them to follow with the young man's plan. He delivers the sack back and tells the young man to take the rabbit very alive to the cabin. Extremely happy with the decision of his mentor, Juwon adjusts the sack on his shoulders and prepares to continue the path. The young man advances with very slow and silent steps through the forest so as not to scare the little animal he carries in the thickness of the forest. A small furry creature lurks silently from behind the bushes. At a distance, the old hunter's cabin reposes peaceful under the soft light of midday in the province. Inside the house, Juwon reflects on how his old life on Earth was empty and without any perspective of one day constituting his own family. While he carves a piece of wood with a rustic knife, he admits finding it a bit strange to be doing that, but understands that everything changed now that he finally has the family he always dreamed of. The young man feels he finally found a genuine purpose to fight, live, and strive every day in the mountains. Suddenly, he distracts himself upon noticing a small wooden box forgotten on top of a table. In the corner of the room, Juwon approaches curious and perceives that the wooden plates stored inside there contain characters of the language of that world sculpted in them, with his eyes shining. From hope, he grabs one of the plates thinking that this can be the ideal resource to help him decode the local writing. He shows the object to his master, and gesturing with his limited vocabulary, asks earnestly for him to teach him to read those words. The old man turns around surprised and asks if he really has interest in learning to read, receiving a response filled with determination from his disciple. The old hunter scratches his head thoughtful in front of the uncommon request, deciding to attend to the young man's desire. The old man walks resolute to a great wooden chest in the corner of the room to search for the study material. Opening the chest, he turns over his old belongings and comments that Juwon certainly will need the complete set of plates to learn right. The master delivers a bundle with several wooden plates into the hands of the young man, who asks with enthusiasm for the old man to begin the lessons. The experienced hunter asks for the young man to follow him to the study table to initiate the learning. Seated comfortably, Juwon takes a writing quill and begins to practice the local writing under the supervision of the old man. The mentor observes the focused young man and thinks in silence how bizarre it is for a simple hunter to demonstrate so much interest in learning to read. He recalls when he bought those wooden plates in the past, dreaming of one day obtaining military achievements and being hired by some influential noble of the court. The old man sighs upon thinking of the precious time he wasted, learning to read just to end up living isolated and forgotten in the forest. However, he soon shakes his head to push away the melancholy, decided to forget once and for all the frustrations of the past, and focus on the present. The old hunter decides it is time to begin patrolling the deepest mountains in search of traces of goblins. He knows that the activity of these wicked creatures increases drastically during spring, just as happens in the mating period of animals. Looking from afar at Juhuan focused on studies, the master recognizes that despite the inexperience, the young man learns everything with extreme quickness and will become a formidable hunter if he cooperates with the right companions. Feeling an intense pain in his injured leg, the old man senses that the moment to confront the wretched goblins is closer and closer, taken by an old desire of vengeance. The mentor swears to himself he will hunt and kill until the last of those monsters. Meanwhile, in the cozy cabin, life follows peaceful. Under the light of the day, Lizzie cuts a piece of fabric to make a new clothing item for Dorothy, who observes anxious and asks all excited when everything will be ready. Lizzie laughs with affection and jokes, asking if the girl knows how many times she already made that same question, receiving a cute and innocent answer. Suddenly, a noise at the door draws Lizzie's attention, who turns quickly expecting to find Juwan. Juwan enters with open arms, and little Dorothy runs joyfully to receive him with a warm hug. The young man lifts his adoptive daughter in his lap, while she displays proud her new orange dress. Upon bending down to gather the hunting sack with the other hand, Juhuan draws the little girl's attention, who perceives something strange inside there. Dorothy gets startled to notice that the cloth sack is flailing and moving from one side to the other. Curious, the girl asks, intrigued if that is some type of trick or if her father is using a secret magic of sacks. Juwan smiles, saying it is not magic, and prepares to untie the knot with just one of his hands, while he carries the little one in his lap, leaving Lizzie impressed with such strength. Lizzie approaches gently and extends her hands to help her husband untie the tight knot. As soon as the loop is undone, two long, furry ears hop from inside the opening out of the sack. Dorothy takes a startle of those upon seeing the beast move suddenly and huddles completely in her father's arms. Juwan bends down, smiling, and warns that it is clear that Dorothy also will win a special kiss of goodbye. He gives a loud kiss on the girl's cheek, who opens a radiant smile of pure happiness before seeing her father depart to the forest. Lizzie holds the sack with care and begins to pull slowly the little head of the animal out. Suddenly, the rabbit hops all at once with so much energy that it makes the young woman lose balance and fall seated on the wooden floor. Dorothy widens her golden eyes in absolute shock with the sudden appearance of the little beast, pointing with her trembling finger. The little girl stammers, scared, saying that this rabbit is very weird. She focuses her attention directly on the top of the little animal's head while it moves its long ears. Dorothy shouts, surprised to notice a small pointed horn right in the middle of the cute rabbit's forehead, which just tilts its head without understanding anything of their amazement.